Section 88 of the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Valerie Marino. The World Story, Volume 13, The United States. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 88, Lee's Surrender, 1865, by Morris Schaff. Conversations between Longstreet and Lee as to Grant's prospective terms continued in broken sentences till Babcock was seen approaching. And then, as Lee still seemed apprehensive of humiliating demands, Longstreet suggested to him that in that event he should break off the interview and tell Grant to do his worst. The thought of another round seemed to brace him, and he rode with Colonel Marshall to meet the Union commander. So closes Longstreet's account of that incident. Lee directed Marshall to find a suitable house for the conference, and he chose McLean's, the best in the town, a brick building with elms and locusts about it, and rose bushes blooming on the lawn, with a cool, inviting veranda. It stood facing west, the last in the village. Marshall sent his orderly back to notify Lee, and he and Babcock soon were seated in the parlor, the left-hand room as you enter the hall. Meanwhile, Traveler's humane groom removed his bit, and he began to nip the fresh springing grass in the dooryard, while Babcock's orderly sat mounted out in the road to notify Grant on his arrival. Ord, Sheridan, Custer, Griffin, and with him my friend Merrill and their staffs were up on the road only a few hundred yards away and in full view. Grant, after dispatching Babcock, mounted at once and followed the Walker's Church Road till he came to the LaGrange Road. This he took to the left and then struck down across Plain Run to the Lynchburg Road. As he passed to the left of the 1st New York Dragoons, someone shouted, "There comes General Grant." He rode directly to Sheridan's group, saying as he drew rein, "How are you, Sheridan?" "First rate, thank you. How are you?" replied Sheridan with an expressive smile. And then he told Grant what had happened, and that he believed it was a ruse on the part of the Confederates to get away. But Grant answered that he had no doubt of the good faith of Lee, and asked where he was. "In that brick house," responded Sheridan. "Well then, we'll go over," said Grant, and asked them all to go along with him. This must have been about 1 o'clock, for Lyman says that at 2:20 Colonel Kellogg, Sheridan's chief commissary, accompanied by a member of Lee's staff, brought a note from Grant to Meade to suspend hostilities. Cincinnati, sired by the king of the turf, Lexington, with his delicate ears, high and thoroughbred port, led the way, and at his side was Rienzi carrying Sheridan. For some reason or other, perhaps because as a boy I played with the colts on the old home farm, those horses, from the day I saw Grant on Cincinnati and Sheridan on Rienzi in the wilderness, have seemed like acquaintances to me, and now it pleases my fancy to put them with Traveler in a pasture far, far beyond the reach of thundering guns or lamenting bugles, a pasture that remains eternally green. As Grant mounted the steps and entered the hall, Babcock, who had seen his approach, opened the door. Sheridan, Ord, and the other officers remained outside and took seats on 2 benches, one on either side of the door and the steps of the veranda. Grant, about 5 feet 8 inches tall, his square shoulders inclined to stoop, was without a sword, wore a soldier's dark blue flannel displaying a waistcoat of like material, and ordinary top boots with trousers inside. Boots and clothing were spattered with mud, and in his memoirs, with his usual unstudied frankness, he says, "In my rough traveling suit, the uniform of a private, with the straps of a lieutenant general, bullion-bordered rectangles holding on their ground of black velvet, 1 large and 2 smaller stars, I must have contrasted strangely with a man so handsomely dressed, 6 feet high and of faultless form." But this was not a matter that I thought of until afterwards. Never was a great man less self-conscious than he, though, as I have observed elsewhere, while at the head of the Army of the Potomac, he maintained his dignity day in and day out, without charging the air of his headquarters with the usual pompous military fuss. This I know from experience, and although I was a mere boy, had he shown any affections, I believe I should have noticed them. The kind and cut of his beard, deep brown in shade, the way his hair lay, and the outline of his face are familiar. But his eyes, so charitable, direct, and his voice, so softly vibrant, veracious, and sweet, must have been seen and heard to be duly appreciated. Under the depths of his quiet and modest reserve lay a persistent and intense doggedness of purpose, as prompt and unconquerable as Lee's pride and burning enthusiasm. And thus, strangely balanced, stood those types and creations of American society of their generation facing each other. Grant greeted Lee very civilly, says Marshall, and I have no doubt that he and his superb kinsman and chief at once felt the charm of that gentle, inflexible composure which every crowned head of the world who afterward met him felt and remarked upon. Lee said to Grant with his customary urbanity that he remembered him well in the old army, to which Grant, with his usual modesty, replied that he remembered him perfectly, but thought it unlikely that he had attracted Lee's attention sufficiently to be remembered after such a long interval. Lee soon found himself in a stream of pleasant reminiscences with Grant about the Mexican War, and it could not have been otherwise, for there was something so quietly companionable in Grant's manner that everyone whom he met, informally and socially, always joined him in his unpremeditated talk. And I think I can see Lee's brown, vigilant eyes kindle with inquisitive wonder as in the course of their conversation they fell on him. The same wonder had been in Meade's and every old officer's eyes, save Sherman's, since Grant's star broke through its dark eclipse. There stood the man whose marvelous career had started wave after wave of camp gossip in both armies, the hero of Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, now about to receive the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia and leave a name shining unchallenged and unclouded at the climax of the war. And yet, in the full glow of this impending fame, mild, unconscious of self, and unpretentious, it was Lee who finally had to remind Grant of the object of their meeting and suggest that he put his terms in writing. Another proof of Grant's inherent delicacy, which made him reluctant to broach a painful subject. Grant asked for his manifold orderly book, and on receiving it took a seat at the little center table and rapidly, with only a single momentary pause, wrote his terms. He says that when he put his pen to its task, he did not know the first word he should make use of in his writing. The terms were as follows: Appomattox, C.T. H. V.A., April 9th, 1865. General R. Lee, commanding C.S.A. General, in accordance with the substance of my letter to you of the 8th inst., I propose to receive the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia on the following terms, to wit, rolls of all the officers and men to be made in duplicate, one copy to be given to an officer to be designated by me, the other to be retained by such officer or officers as you may designate, the officers to give their individual paroles not to take up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged, and each company or regimental commander to sign a like parole for the men of their commands. The arms, artillery, and public property to be parked and stacked and turned over to the officers appointed by me to receive them. This will not embrace the sidearms of the officers, nor their private horses or baggage. This done, each officer and man will be allowed to return to his home, not to be disturbed by the United States authorities, so long as they observe their paroles, and the laws in force where they may reside. Very respectfully, U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. When he came to the end of the sentence, closing with, appointed by me to receive them, he raised his eyes, and they fell on Lee's lion-headed, stately sword, and then he wrote, This will not embrace the sidearms of the officers, nor their private horses. Grant probably thought of Traveller, and the pang it would give him to part with Cincinnati were he in Lee's place. It is needless for me to point out the significance of the last sentence. binding as it did the passions and pledging the honor of his country. In short, it meant that there should be no judicial bloodshed, no gibbets, and no mourning exiles. These terms, in the light of all that might have happened after the assassination of Mr. Lincoln, which took place within 5 days of the surrender, lent elevation, repose, and dignity to humanity, and I have no doubt the eyes of the country's guardian angel welled with tears of joy. Grant finishes the terms, rises, goes to Lee, and hands him the open order book. Remaining seated, Lee lays it on the table beside him, and with deliberation takes out his spectacles and adjusts them. Slowly and carefully he reads line after line. All eyes are on Lee. A hush silent as death prevails. When Lee came to the end, he raised his eyes, looked at Grant, and remarked, "This will have a very happy effect upon my army." Grant then said he would have the terms copied in ink, unless he had some suggestions to make. Lee replied one only, that the cavalry and artillerymen owned their own horses, and he would like to understand whether or not they would be allowed to retain them. Grant told him the terms as written would not allow of this, but as he thought this was about the last of the war, he would instruct the officers in carrying them out to allow everyone claiming to own a horse or mule to take the animal to his home, so that they could put in a crop to tide them over through the next winter, which he feared might be one of want and suffering, owing to the wide devastation. Lee is reported to have said then, "This will have the best possible effect upon the men. It will be very gratifying and will do much toward conciliating our people." While the terms were being copied, Lee told Grant that he had a number of prisoners whom he should be glad to release, as he had no provisions for them or his own men, who had been living for the last few days on parched corn and what they could gather along the route. Grant asked him to send the prisoners within his lines, and said that he would take steps at once to have Lee's army supplied, but was sorry to say that he was entirely out of forage for the animals. In inquiry as to the number of men to be fed, Lee was unable to answer, and Grant asked, "Suppose I send over 25,000 rations, will that be enough?" "More than enough," replied Lee. Grant directed Morgan, his chief commissary, to see that Lee's army was fed. By this time the terms were copied, and when they were signed it was about 2:30 or 3 o'clock. Lee shook hands with Grant, bowed to the other officers, and left the room. Colonel Payne of Ord's staff says, as Lee came out of the room and stopped for a moment in the doorway, those of us on the porch arose and complimented him with the usual salute to a superior officer. He seemed pleased at this mark of respect, and looking to the right and left, he raised his own hat in recognition of the attention. As he drew on a pair of apparently new gloves, he stood so close to me that his initials worked in white silk on the guard of the gauntlet were plainly observed. Having signaled for his horse, Lee stood on the lowest step of the veranda while the groom was rebridling him, and from time to time his eyes rested on the leaning fields, spotted by the colors of the army. He had just surrendered. He smote his gauntleted hands together unconsciously. When Traveler was led up, he mounted him at once. Grant then stepped down from the veranda, and as he passed Lee, touched his hat. Lee returned the salute and rode away. Marshall says that if General Grant and the other officers who were present at the McLean house had studied how not to offend, they could not have borne themselves with more good breeding. End of section 88. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Valerie Marino.
Section 89 of the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. The World's Story, Volume 13, The United States, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 89. America After the Civil War, by William Ewart, Gladstone. If there be those in England who think that American democracy means public levity and intemperance, or a lack of skill and sagacity in politics, or the absence of self-command and self-denial, let them bear in mind a few of the most salient and recent facts of history, which may profitably be recommended to their reflections. We emancipated 1 million of Negroes by peaceful legislation. America liberated 4 or 5 millions by a bloody civil war. Yet the industry and exports of the Southern states are maintained, while those of our Negro colonies have dwindled. The South enjoys all its franchises, but we have, pro pudor, found no better method of providing for peace and order in Jamaica, the chief of our islands, than by the hard and vulgar, even where needful, expedient of abolishing entirely its representative institutions. The Civil War compelled the states, both North and South, to train and embody 1.5 million of men, and to present to view the great, instead of the smallest, armed forces in the world. Here there was supposed to arise a double danger. First, that on a sudden cessation of the war, military life and habits could not be shaken off, and having become rudely and widely predominant, would bias the country toward an aggressive policy, or still worse, would find vent on predatory or revolutionary operations. Secondly, that the military caste would grow up with its habits of exclusiveness and command, and would influence the tone of politics in a direction adverse to republican freedom. But both apprehensions proved to be wholly imaginary. The innumerable soldiery was at once dissolved. Cincinnatus, no longer an unique example, became the commonplace of every day, the type and mold of a nation. The whole enormous mass quietly resumed the habits of social life. The generals of yesterday were the editors, the secretaries, and the solicitors of today. The just jealousy of the state gave life to the now forgotten maxim of Judge Blackstone, who denounced as perilous the erection of a separate profession of arms in a free country. The standing army, expanded by the heat of civil contest to gigantic dimensions, settled down into the framework of a miniature with the returning temperature of civil life, and became a power well nigh invisible from its minuteness, amidst the powers which swayed the movements of a society exceeding 40 millions. More remarkable still was the financial sequel to the great conflict. The internal taxation for federal purposes, which before its commencement had been unknown, was raised in obedience to an exigency of life and death, so as to exceed every present and every past example. It pursued and worried all the transactions of life. The interest of the American debt grew to be the highest in the world, and the capital touched 560 millions sterling. Here was provided for the faith and patience of a people, a touchstone of extreme severity. In England, at the close of the great French War, the propertied classes, who were supreme in Parliament, at once rebelled against the Tory government, and refused to prolong the income tax even for a single year. We talked big, both then and now, about the payment of our national debt, but 63 years have since elapsed, all of them except 2, called years of peace, and we have reduced the huge debt by about 1/9, that is to say, by a little over 100 millions, or scarcely more than 1.5 million a year. This is the conduct of a state elaborately digested into orders and degrees, famed for wisdom and forethought, and consolidated by a long experience. But America continued not long to bear, on her unaccustomed and still smarting shoulders, the burden of the war taxation. In 12 years she has reduced her debt by 158 millions sterling, or at the rate of 13 millions for every year. In each 12 months she has done what we did in 8 years. Her self-command, self-denial, and wise forethought for the future have been, to say the least, 8-fold ours. These are facts which redound greatly to her honor, and the historian will record with surprise that an enfranchised nation tolerated burdens which in England a selected class, possessed of the representation, did not dare to face, and that the most unmitigated democracy known to the annals of the world resolutely reduced of its own cost prospective liabilities of the state, which the aristocratic and plutocratic and monarchical government of the United Kingdom has been contented ignobly to hand over to posterity. And such facts should be told out. It is our fashion so to tell them, against as well as for ourselves, and the record of them may some day be among the means of stirring us up to a policy more worthy of the name and fame of England. End of Section 89. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 90 of the United States, read for LibriVox.org by Jim Locke. The United States, Volume 2, Part 13, Stories of the Western Indians, Historical Note. Most of the Indian outbreaks of the last half-century have been caused by the governmental command to move on. During the presidency of Jackson, the Indians were bidden to remove to the country west of the Mississippi. Some made no resistance, but others opposed bitterly, and the Black Hawk War in Illinois and Wisconsin, as well as the war in Florida, were the result. As the number of white inhabitants increased, they called for more arable land. Then, too, silver and gold were discovered. To make desirable regions available for the whites, the government forced the Indians, not once but again and again, to leave their homes and depart to some less valuable part of the country. There is as much variety in Indian tribes and in individual Indians as in white folk. Some are fierce and warlike, others are inclined to be friendly, some are industrious and eager to learn, while others are lazy and willingly ignorant. As a race, the Indians are rapidly disappearing. Within the last 70 years of the 19th century, the Pawnees, for instance, decreased from 12,000 to fewer than 700. The native California Indians have almost entirely died out. 20 tribes on the Oregon coast have dwindled to 437 persons. End of Section 90. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 91 of the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. The World's Story, Volume 13, The United States, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 91, A Choctaw Holiday, about 1850, by George Catlin. When I was staying at the Choctaw Agency in the midst of their nation, it seemed to be a sort of season of amusements, a kind of holiday, when the whole tribe almost were assembled around the establishment, and from day to day we were entertained with some games or feats that were exceedingly amusing. Horse racing, dancing, wrestling, foot racing, and ball playing were amongst the most exciting, and of all the catalogue the most beautiful was decidedly that of ball playing. This wonderful game, which is the favourite one amongst all the tribes, and with these southern tribes played exactly the same, can never be appreciated by those who are not happy enough to see it. It is no uncommon occurrence for 600 or 800 or 1,000 of these young men to engage in a game of ball, with 5 or 6 times that number of spectators, of men, women, and children surrounding the ground and looking on. And I pronounce such a scene, with its hundreds of nature's most beautiful models denuded and painted of various colours, running and leaping into the air in all the most extravagant and varied forms, in the desperate struggle for the ball, a school for that painter or sculptor equal to any of those that ever inspired the hand of the artist in the Olympian Games or the Roman Forum. I have made it a uniform rule, whilst in the Indian country, to attend every ball play I could hear of, if I could do it by riding a distance of 20 or 30 miles. and my usual custom has been, on such occasions, to straddle the back of my horse and look on to the best advantage. In this way I have sat, and oftentimes reclined, and almost dropped from my horse's back with irresistible laughter at the succession of droll tricks and kicks and scuffles which ensue in the almost superhuman struggle for the ball. These plays generally commence at 9 o'clock or near it in the morning, and I have more than once balanced myself on my pony from that time till near sundown without more than 1 minute of intermission at a time before the game has been decided. While at the Choctaw Agency it was announced that there was to be a great play on a certain day within a few miles, on which occasion I attended and made 3 sketches, and also the following entry in my notebook, which I literally copy out. Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock I rode out with Lieutenants S. and M. to a very pretty prairie about 6 miles distant, to the ball playground of the Choctaws, where we found several thousand Indians encamped. There were 2 points of timber about half a mile apart, in which the 2 parties for the play, with their respective families and friends, were encamped, and lying between them the prairie on which the game was to be played. My companions and myself, although we had been apprised that to see the whole of a ball play we must remain on the ground all the night previous, had brought nothing to sleep upon, resolving to keep our eyes open and see what transpired during the night. During the afternoon we loitered about amongst the different tents and shanties of the 2 encampments, and afterwards at sundown witnessed the ceremony of measuring out the ground and erecting the buys or goals which were to guide the play. Each party had their goal made with 2 upright posts set firm in the ground, with a pole across at the top. These goals were about 40 or 50 rods apart, and at a point just halfway between was another small stake driven down, where the ball was to be thrown up at the firing of a gun, to be struggled for by the players. All this preparation was made by some old men, who were, it seemed, selected to be the judges of the play, who drew a line from one buy to the other, to which directly came from the woods on both sides a great concourse of women and old men, boys and girls, and dogs and horses, where bets were to be made on the play. The betting was all done across this line, and seemed to be chiefly left to the women, who seemed to have marshalled out a little of everything that their houses and their fields possessed. Goods and chattels, knives, dresses, blankets, pots and kettles, dogs and horses and guns, and all were placed in the possession of stakeholders, who sat by them and watched them on the ground all night preparatory to the play. The sticks with which this tribe play are bent into an oblong hoop at the end, with a sort of slight web of small thongs tied across, to prevent the ball from passing through. The players hold one in each hand, and by leaping into the air they catch the ball between the 2 nettings and throw it, without being allowed to strike it or catch it in their hands. In every ball play of these people it is a rule of the play that no man shall wear moccasins on his feet, or any other dress than his breechcloth around his waist, with a beautiful bead belt, and a tail made of white horsehair or quills, and a mane on their neck, of horsehair dyed of various colours. This game had been arranged and made up 3 or 4 months before the parties met to play it, and in the following manner. The 2 champions who led the 2 parties, and had the alternate choosing of the players through the whole tribe, sent runners with the ball sticks most fantastically ornamented with ribbons and red paint, to be touched by every one of the chosen players, who thereby agreed to be on the spot at the appointed time and ready for the play. The ground having been all prepared, and preliminaries of the game all settled, and the bettings all made, and goods all staked, night came on without the appearance of any players on the ground. But soon after dark a procession of lighted flambeaux was seen coming from each encampment to the ground, where the players assembled around their respective buys, and at the beat of the drums and chants of the women, each party of players commenced the ball play dance. Each party danced for a quarter of an hour around their respective buys, in their ball play dress, rattling their ball sticks together in the most violent manner, and all singing as loud as they could raise their voices, whilst the women of each party, who had their goods at stake, formed into 2 rows on the line, between the two parties of players, and danced also in a uniform step, and all their voices joined in chants to the Great Spirit, in which they were soliciting his favour in deciding the game to their advantage, and also encouraging the players to exert every power they possessed in the struggle that was to ensue. In the meantime 4 old medicine men, who were to have the starting of the ball, and who were to be the judges of the play, were seated at the point where the ball was to be started, and busily smoking to the Great Spirit for their success in judging rightly and impartially between the parties in so important an affair. This dance was one of the most picturesque scenes imaginable, and was repeated at intervals of every half hour during the night, and exactly in the same manner, so that the players were certainly awake all the night and arrayed in their appropriate dress, prepared for the play, which was to commence at 9 o'clock the next morning. In the morning, at the hour, the two parties and all their friends were drawn out and over the ground, where at length the game commenced by the judges throwing up the ball at the firing of a gun, when an instant struggle ensued between the players, who were some 600 or 700 in numbers, and were mutually endeavouring to catch the ball in their sticks and throw it home and between their respective stakes, which, whenever successfully done, counts 1 for the game. In this game all the players were dressed alike, that is, divested of all dress except the girdle and the tail, which I have before described, and in these desperate struggles for the ball, when it is up, where hundreds are running together and leaping actually over each other's heads, and darting between their adversaries' legs, tripping and throwing, and foiling each other in every possible manner, and every voice raised to the highest key, in shrill yelps and barks, there are rapid successions of feats and of incidents that astonish and amuse far beyond the conception of anyone who has not had the singular good luck to witness them. In these struggles every mode is used that can be devised to oppose the progress of the foremost, who is likely to get the ball, and these obstructions often meet desperate individual resistance, which terminates in violent scuffle, and sometimes in fisticuffs, when their sticks are dropped and the parties are unmolested, whilst they are settling it between themselves, unless it be a general stampedo, to which they are subject who are down, if the ball happens to pass in their direction. Every weapon, by a rule of all ball play, is laid by in their respective encampments, and no man allowed to go for one, so that the sudden broils that take place on the ground are presumed to be as suddenly settled without any probability of much personal injury, and no one is allowed to interfere in any way with the contentious individuals. There are times when the ball gets to the ground, and such a confused mass rushing together around it, and knocking their sticks together, without the possibility of anyone getting or seeing it, for the dust that they raise, that the spectator loses his strength and everything else but his senses, when the condensed mass of ball sticks and shins and bloody noses is carried around the different parts of the ground for a quarter of an hour at a time, without any one of the mass being able to see the ball, and which they are often thus scuffling for several minutes after it has been thrown off and played over another part of the ground. For each time that the ball was passed between the stakes of either party, 1 was counted for their game, and a halt of about 1 minute, when it was again started by the judges of the play, and a similar struggle ensued, and so on, until the successful party arrived to 100, which was the limit of the game, and accomplished at an hour's sun, when they took the stakes, and then, by a previous agreement, produced a number of jugs of whisky, which gave all a wholesome drink, and sent them all off, merry and in good humour, but not drunk. After this exciting day, the concourse was assembled in the vicinity of the Agency House, where we had a great variety of dances and other amusements, the most of which I have described on former occasions. One, however, was new to me, and I must say a few words of it. This was the Eagle Dance, a very pretty scene, which is got up by their young men in honour of that bird, for which they seem to have a religious regard. This picturesque dance was given by 12 or 16 men, whose bodies were chiefly naked, and painted white with white clay, and each one holding in his hand the tail of the eagle, while his head was also decorated with an eagle's quill. Spears were stuck in the ground, around which the dance was performed by 4 men at a time, who had, simultaneously at the beat of the drum, jumped up from the ground where they had all sat in rows of 4, one row immediately behind the other, and ready to take the place of the first 4 when they left the ground fatigued, which they did by hopping or jumping around behind the rest, and taking their seats ready to come up again in their turn, after each of the other sets had been through the same forms. In this dance the steps, or rather jumps, were different from anything I had ever witnessed before, as the dancers were squat down, with their bodies almost to the ground, in a severe and most difficult posture. I have already, in a former letter, while speaking of the ancient custom of flattening the head, given a curious tradition of this interesting tribe, accounting for their having come from the west, and I here insert another or 2, which I had, as well as the former one, from the lips of Peter Pinchlin, a very intelligent and influential man in the tribe. The Deluge. Our people have always had a tradition of the deluge, which happened in this way. There was total darkness for a great time over the whole of the earth. The Choctaw doctors or mystery men looked out for daylight for a long time, until at last they despaired of ever seeing it, and the whole nation were very unhappy. At last a light was discovered in the north, and there was great rejoicing, until it was found to be great mountains of water rolling on, which destroyed them all, except a few families who had expected it and built a great raft, on which they were saved. Future state. Our people all believe that the spirit lives in a future state, that it has a great distance to travel after death towards the west, that it has to cross a dreadful deep and rapid stream, which is hemmed in on both sides by high and rugged hills. Over this stream, from hill to hill, there lies a long and slippery pine log, with the bark peeled off, over which the dead have to pass to the delightful hunting grounds. On the other side of the stream there are 6 persons of the good hunting ground, with rocks in their hands, which they throw at them all when they are on the middle of the log. The good walk on safely to the good hunting grounds, where there is one continual day, where the trees are always green, where the sky has no clouds, where there are continual fine and cooling breezes, where there is one continual scene of feasting, dancing, and rejoicing, where there is no pain or trouble, and people never grow old, but for ever live young and enjoy the youthful pleasures. The wicked see the stones coming and try to dodge, by which they fall from the log and go down thousands of feet to the water, which is dashing over the rocks and is smelling of dead fish and animals, where they are carried round and brought continually back to the same place in whirlpools, where the trees are all dead and the waters are full of toads and lizards and snakes, where the dead are always hungry and have nothing to eat, are always sick and never die, where the sun never shines, and where the wicked are continually climbing up by thousands on the sides of a high rock, from which they can overlook the beautiful country of the good hunting grounds, the place of the happy, but they can never reach it. End of section 91.
Section 92 of the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World Story, Volume 13, The United States, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 92. What the Indians Thought of the White Men, by George Bird Grinnell. Knowledge of the white man came to the different tribes of the West at different times, but a century ago most of them knew little of him, and there are many tribes which have had a real intercourse with the whites for a still shorter time. Long before this, the Spaniards in the Southwest and on the Pacific coast had made their presence felt, but the Indians usually do not consider that Spaniards are of the same race with the people of European origin, who came to them from the East, and often they have a special name for them. Even after the Indians had learned of the existence of the white people, they did not at once come into contact with them. It was often quite a long time before they even began to trade with them, and when they did so, it was in a very small way. The first articles traded for were arms, beads, blankets, and the gaudy finery that the savage loves. Horses, which transformed the Indian from a mild and peaceful seeker after food to a warrior and a raider, were by many tribes first obtained, not directly from the whites, but by barter from those of their own race. Most tribes still preserve traditions of the time when they first met the white men, as well as of the time when they first saw horses, but in many cases this was so long ago that all details of the occurrence have been lost. It is certain that the Spaniards and their horses had worked their way up the Pacific slope into Oregon and Washington long before there was any considerable influx of white trappers into the plains country and the Rocky Mountains, and that of the western tribes, those which in miles were farthest from Mexico, were the last to learn of the whites and their wonderful powers. One of these peoples was the Blackfeet, of whom I have been told by men still living in the tribe that 50 years ago no Blackfoot could count up to 10, and that a little earlier the number of horses in all three tribes of that confederation was very small. Then they had but few guns, and many of them even used still the stone arrowheads and hatchets and the bone knives of their primitive ancestors. A people whose intercourse with the whites has been so short and until recent times so limited ought to retain some detailed account of their earliest meeting with civilized men, and such a tradition has come to me from John Monroe, a half-breed Pigeon, now nearly 70 years old. It tells of the first time the Blackfeet saw white people. A party of traders from the East, either Frenchmen from Montreal or one of the very earliest parties of Hudson Bay men which ascended the Saskatchewan River. John Monroe first heard the narrative when a boy from a blood Indian named Satani, who was then an old man, and Satani's grandfather was one of the party who met the white people. The occurrence probably took place during the latter half of the 18th century. When this people lived in the north, a party of the Blackfeet started out to war. They traveled on, always going southward, until they came to a big water. While passing through a belt of timber on the north bank of this river, they came upon what they took for strange beaver work, where these animals had been cutting down the trees. But on looking closely at the cuttings, they saw that the chips were so large that it must have been an animal much bigger than a beaver that could open its mouth wide enough to cut such chips. They did not understand what this could be, for none of them had ever seen anything like it before. Each man expressed his mind about this, and at last they concluded that some great underwater animal must have done it. At one place they saw that the trunk of a tree was missing, and found the trail over the ground where it had been dragged away from the stump. They followed this trail so as to see where the animals had taken the log and what they had done with it, and as they went on they found many other small trails like this one, all leading into one larger main trail. They then saw the footprints of persons, but they were prints of a foot shaped differently from theirs. There was a deep mark at the heel. The tracks were not flat like those made by people. They followed the trail, which kept getting larger and wider as it went. Every little while another trail joined it. When they came to where they could look through the timber, they saw before them a little open spot on the bank of the river. They looked through the underbrush and saw what they at first thought were bears, and afterward took to be persons lifting logs and putting them up in a large pile. They crept closer to where they could see better, and then concluded that these were not people. They were very woolly on the face. Long masses of hair hung down from their chins. They were not clothed. wore no robes. The Blackfeet said, "Why, they have nothing on. They are naked." Some of them said, "Those are Suyatupi, water people." They stole around to another point of the timber, still nearer, where they could see better. There they came close to one of these people alone. He was gathering sticks and putting them in a pile. They saw that the skin of his hands and face was white. This one had no hair on his face. So they said, "Well, this must be a she-water animal. The he ones have hair in the face, and the she ones do not." The oldest man of the party then said, "We had better go away. Maybe they will smell us or feel us here, and perhaps they will kill us or do something fearful. Let us go." So they went away. When they got back to their camp, they told what they had seen, that to the south they had found animals that were very much like people, water animals. They said that these animals were naked, that some of them had red bodies, wore red shirts, and some were black all over, except a red mark around the bodies and a fine red tail. The red sash worn by the old Hudson's Bay men. Moreover, these people wore no robes or leggings, and no breech clouts. This description caused a great excitement in the camp. Some thought that the strange beings were water animals, and others that they were a new people. All the men of the camp started south to see what this could be. Before they left the camp, the head man told them to be very careful in dealing with the animals, not to interfere with them, nor to get in their way, and not to try to hurt them, nor to anger them. The party started, and when they reached the opening, the animals were still there at work. After they had watched them for some time, the head man of the party said to the others, "All you stay here, and I will go down to them alone. If they do nothing to me, you wait here, but if they attack or hurt me, you rush on them, and we will fight hard and try not to let them capture any of us." The man started, and when he came close to the corner of the houses, he stood still. One of the men who was working nearby walked up to him, looked him straight in the face, and stretched out his arm. The Indian looked at him and did not know what he wanted. Some more of the men came up to him, and the Indian saw that all of them were persons like himself, except that they were of a different color and had a different voice. The hair on their faces was fair. When the other Indians saw that no harm had been done to their leader, some of them went down to him, one by one and by twos and threes, but most of the party remained hidden in the timber. They were still afraid of these strange new beings. The whites spoke to them and asked them to come into the house, making motions to them, but the Indians did not understand what was meant by these signs. The whites would walk away and then come back and take hold of the Indians' robes and pull them. At last some of the Blackfeet followed the white men into the house. Those who had gone in came back and told the others strange stories of the wonderful things they had seen in this house. As they gained confidence, many others went in, while still others would not go in, nor would they go close to the new people. The whites showed them a long and curious-looking piece of wood. They did not know of what kind of stone one part of it was made. It was hard and black. The white man took down from the wall a white cow's horn and poured out some black sand into his hand and poured it down into a hole in this long stick. Then he took a little bunch of grass and pushed this into the hole with another stick, and measured with his fingers the length of the stick left out of the hole. Then he took a round thing out of a bag and put it into the hole and put down some more fine grass. Then he poured out some more of the black sand into the side of the stick. The Indians stood around, taking great interest in the way the man was handling the stick. The white man now began to make all kinds of signs to the Indians, which they did not understand. Sometimes he would make a big sound with his mouth and then point to the stick. He would put the stick to his shoulder, holding it out in front of him, and make a great many motions. Then he gave it to one of the Indians. He showed him the underparts and put his finger there. The Indian touched the underpart, and the stick went off in the air and made a thundering sound, a terrible crash. The Indian staggered back, and the others were very much scared. Some dropped to the ground, while all the whites laughed and shook their heads at them. All laughed and made many signs to the Blackfeet, none of which they understood. The white man took down the horn of black sand and again did these things to the stick, but this time the Indians all stood back. They were afraid. When he had finished the motions, The white man invited them out of doors. Then he sat down and took aim at a log lying on the ground. The same great thunder sounded. He walked up to the log, showed the bullet hole, and pushed a little stick into it. Then he loaded the gun again. By this time the Indians were beginning to understand the power of the stick. After the white men had loaded it, he handed the gun to the Indian, took him close to the log, showed him how to aim the gun and how to pull the trigger. The Indian fired and hit the log. The white men showed these Blackfeet their knives, whittling sticks with them, and showing them how well they could cut. The Indians were very much delighted with the power of these knives. Then they saw a big woolly white man standing out in front of the house, and he with his axe would cut a big log in two in only a short time. All these things were very strange to them. The white men looked closely at the Blackfeet, wore dresses and arms, and wanted them, and gave their visitors some knives and copper cups for their dresses and the skins that they wore. The visitors stayed with the white men some days, camping near by. They kept wondering at these people, at how they looked, the things which they had, and what they did. The white men kept making signs to them, but they understood nothing of it all. After a time the Blackfeet returned to their camp. Afterward many others visited the whites, and this was the beginning of a friendly intercourse between the two peoples. After a time they came to understand each other a little, and trade relations were opened. The Indians learned that they could get the white man's things in exchange for the skins of small animals, and they began to trade and to get guns. It was when they got these arms that they first began to take courage and to go out of the timber on to the prairie toward the mountains. End of section 92. This recording is in the public domain. Section 93 of the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World Story, Volume 13, The United States, edited by Eva March Tappan, Section 93. The Indian Story of the Custer Tragedy, 1877, by James McLaughlin. In the first place, Mrs. Spotted Hornbull was there, which is more than can be said for some of the other ladies and gentlemen who have told of the events of that dreadful day when Custer led his gallant fellows into the jaws of death, and worse. She was not then carried on the rolls of the Indian Department as Mrs. Spotted Hornbull. A more imaginative sponsor than the Indian agent had given her the more euphonious and, let us hope, more correctly descriptive appellation of Petit San Waste Wind. 28 years ago, when she first came to the agency at Standing Rock, when Spotted Hornbull, who was killed with Sitting Bull, was still in the land of the living Dakotas, she was a strikingly good-looking Indian woman, and much esteemed by her neighbors for her intelligence and capacity. She had also the gift of eloquence, rare in an Indian woman, and a fluency in language and readiness of gesture, which placed her high in the esteem of her story-loving tribesmen. And many a big man among the Sioux had been content to hold his peace when Petit San Waste Wind raised her voice. Not that the voice was raucous, or that beautiful white cow, the English rendition of her name, was a scold. I've heard a story that she on one occasion manhandled a big chief of the Sioux nation, who she learned had maligned her, and that the manhandling followed his remark, "Woman, be silent. You have the mouth of a white man." And knowing Mrs. Spotted Hornbull as I do, I have never doubted the verity of the incident so far as her attack was concerned. She is now a sturdy, upstanding woman of 60 to 65 years of age, born of the Hunkpapa Sioux, a band that has provided the nation with many of its noted men. She was handsome, according to the Indian canons of taste, in her youth, and indeed I am not sure that the Indian taste in these matters might not well be accepted by some more advanced peoples. She was married in early youth to Spotted Hornbull, a chief of his band and a man of prominence as a warrior and adviser, but no orator. She appears to have brought to the family the attributes in which her husband was lacking, for she sat in council of her tribe, and I know of no other Indian woman of her nation who was so signally honored. Her voice was always listened to, for in addition to her gift of eloquence, she was a clear thinker and could make effective the ideas of her silent husband. Since she became a widow and the Sioux no longer hold councils, her neighbors seek her advice in business matters. She has steadfastly refused to accept Christianity, though she has listened to all the arguments that have been made to her. She elects to cling to the beliefs of her fathers, a fact that does not at all detract from the esteem in which the missionaries hold her. A few months ago I met Mrs. Spotted Hornbull by appointment at my son Harry's trading store, located at Oak Creek on the Standing Rock Reservation. She had come in 15 miles from her home on the Missouri River, near the mouth of Oak Creek, for the meeting. I was accompanied by a friend, and she greeted us with the effusive welcome of her people, as different as possible in its warmth and volubility from the greeting one not acquainted intimately with the Sioux might expect. She was a striking figure as she stood up to greet us. This historian and poetess of the Sioux wore the ordinary costume of a woman of her people, but her gingham dress was of the Campbell plaid, her shawl blanket of native make, her moccasins neat, her jetty hair falling into braids on each side of a smiling and expressive countenance. She looked a much younger woman than she really was, and by way of demonstrating that she still felt young, she danced a few steps, laughingly declaring that she had met and danced with many prominent people. It was after a substantial supper, to which Mrs. Spotted Hornbull did full justice, that we sat down in my son's little parlor and listened to her story of the affair on the Little Big Horn. I've always deplored the fact that English writers have never been able to render, in their native elegance and appositeness, the similes used by Indian orators and storytellers. I now deplore the lack of that same capacity in myself. Mrs. Spotted Hornbull exhausted the stores of her flowery vocabulary in the relation we listened to. She talked with great fluency, her voice pitched to a sort of breathless stage of excited feeling. I remember hearing a young woman declaim the chorus in Henry V, put on by an American actor-manager a few years ago. The Sioux storyteller reminded me of the actress. She illustrated her every sentence in pantomime, and when she feared that she had not pictured the scene her memory brought up, she seized a pencil and paper and drew a sketch of the valley of the Little Big Horn, showing the location of the Indian village on the west bank, the distribution of the bands of the Sioux, the points of attack by Custer and Reno, and the fatal hill, now marked by a monument, where Custer fell. This sketch she used constantly to explain her meaning, and she was perfectly frank about the occurrences of June 25, 1876, except on one point. She ignored all questions as to the whereabouts of Sitting Bull during the fight. Skillfully avoiding the interrogation, or totally ignoring it, she made many excursions into Sioux history of that time. But Sitting Bull, her kinsman, who skulked in the hills while his people were carrying out the annihilation of the troops, she would not speak of. Once, exasperated by the questions of the third party to the hearing, she asked if he was a lawyer, and being assured that he was not, she shook hands with him very solemnly and continued her relation. And this is the tale she told. My brother, White Eyebrows, had been to a dance. All through the night he had been making glad the hearts of the maidens, for my brother was good to look upon, and the women of the Hunkpapa know a good man. All the night he had danced with the other young people. It was not a war dance, but just a merry-making of the younger people. A few days previous our men had fought with the Crows and Shoshones, General Crook's allies, and the enemies of my people had fallen as leaves when they turn yellow. We were not harmed, and there was no mourning in the village of the Sioux on the plateau beside the Greasy Grass, the river that the white men call the Little Big Horn. When my brother came to my tepee from the dance, I still slept. Late the night before, I and the other women of the Hunkpapa had labored to make ready for the march that we were to take up that morning. Where we were going, I know not. Where the men of the Sioux go, there go the women. It is their duty and their pleasure. Our people were roaming through the country that had been given them before the coming of the whites. The country was good. There was rich grass for the ponies and sweet water. The fields glowed with prairie flowers of yellow and red and blue. There were buffaloes in the valleys and Indian turnips on the hills for the digging. We were rich in provisions, and no man had a right to put out his hand and tell us that we should not roam. The village by the Greasy Grass was but the stopping place for a day or two, and we had no thought of a fight with the white man. The Crows and Shoshones we had no fears of, for the lodges of the Sioux were many and their men brave as the lion of the mountains. But we were to move out to the northwest, and I had made many bundles of my store. Thus it was that I lay sleeping when my brother came to the tepee in the dawn and asked for food. I unpacked some of the bundles and prepared his breakfast, buffalo meat stewed with turnips, and set it before him, and as he ate, the people of the village awakened, and the sun rose higher. I have said that our lodges were many, but how many people there were I know not. There were about 10,000 Indians, including women and children, in the village. But the women were all at work, and the ponies were being rounded up, and preparations for leaving went on that we might be away before the heat of the day became great, as it sometimes is in the country of my people and in the valleys near the big hills. The village was made along the Greasy Grass and between that river and the Big Horn, which flows north to the Yellowstone. The Blackfeet, who were not many, had the place at the south end of the village. Next to the Blackfeet and closer to the river were my people, the Hunkpapa. Down the river and next to the Hunkpapa were the Minneconjou, and below them the Sanzark. Behind the Hunkpapa, away from the river, were the Ogallala and the Brule, and below the Minneconjou to the north were the Cheyennes. Up the river from the village of the Blackfeet there was thick timber, and through this we could not see. I have seen my people prepare for battle many times, and this I know, that the Sioux that morning had no thought of fighting. We expected no attack, and our young men did not watch for the coming of Long Hair, Custer, and his soldiers. Most of the women were occupied in packing their stores preparatory to breaking camp, and some of them were working along the bank of the river. On the east side of the river an old man had shot a buffalo that morning, and near where the buffalo lay dead some women and children were digging Indian turnips. These people first saw the soldiers, who then were far to the east. They were on the little hills between the Greasy Grass and the Rosebud rivers. They were 6 to 8 miles distant when first seen, and some of the younger people hurried in from the place where the buffalo was killed to notify the camp. We could see the flashing of their sabers and saw that there were very many soldiers in the party. My people went on with their work, making ready to move across the Big Horn, but the teepees were not yet down. The men of the Sioux were much excited, and they watched the coming of Long Hair and hurried the women. The village was not made for a fight, and they would move on. We had seen the soldiers marching along the high ridge on the east side of the river and were watching them, but had not seen these others approaching. Mrs. Spotted Hornbull halted in her story and thought for a few moments. Then she struck her hands sharply together to imitate the rattling of carbine fire and continued, "Like that, the soldiers were upon us. Through the tepee poles their bullets rattled. The sun was several hours high, and the tepees were empty. Bullets coming from a strip of timber on the west bank of the Greasy Grass passed through the tepees of the Blackfeet and Hunkpapa. The broken character of the country across the river, together with the fringe of trees on the west side where our camp was situated, had hidden the advance of a great number of soldiers, which we had not seen until they were close upon us and shooting into our end of the village, where, from seeing the direction taken by the soldiers we were watching, we felt comparatively secure. The women and children cried, fearing they would be killed, but the men, the Hunkpapa and Blackfeet, the Ogallala and Minneconjou, mounted their horses and raced to the Blackfeet teepees. We could still see the soldiers of long hair marching along in the distance, and our men, taken by surprise and from a point whence they had not expected to be attacked, went singing the song of battle into the fight behind the Blackfeet village. And we women wailed over the children, for we believed that the Great Father had sent all his men for the destruction of the Sioux. Some of the women put loads on the travois and would have left, but that their husbands and sons were in the fight. Others tore their hair and wept for the fate that they thought was to be the portion of the Sioux through the anger of the Great Father, but the men were not afraid, and they had many guns and cartridges. Like the fire that, driven by a great wind, sweeps through the heavy grassland where the buffalo range, the men of the Hunkpapa, the Blackfeet, the Ogallala, and the Minneconjou rushed through the village and into the trees where the soldiers of the white chief had stopped to fire. The soldiers, Renos, had been sent by Longhair to surprise the village of my people. Silently had they moved off around the hills, and keeping out of sight of the young men of our people, had crept in, south of what men now call Reno Hill. They had crossed the greasy grass and climbed the bench from the bank. The way from the river to the plateau upon which our teepees stood was level, but the soldiers were on foot when they came in sight of the Blackfeet. Then it was that they fired and warned us of their approach. Mrs. Spotted Hornbull stopped an instant and then said, if the soldiers had not fired until all of them were ready for the attack, if they had brought their horses and rode into the camp of the Sioux, the power of the Dakota nation might have been broken and our young men killed in the surprise, for they were watching Longhair only and had no thought of an attack anywhere, while they could see his soldiers traveling along parallel with the river on the opposite side and more than a rifle shot back from the river. Longhair had planned cunningly that Reno should attack in the rear, while he rode down and gave battle from the front of the village looking on the river. But the Great Spirit was watching over his red children. He allowed the white chief Reno to strike too soon, and the braves of the Sioux ran over his soldiers and beat them down as corn before the hail. They fought a few minutes, and the men of the Hunkpapa, the Blackfeet, Ogallala, and the Minneconjou bore them down and slew many of them. All who did not get across the river were killed, and Longhair was still 3 miles away when nearly all of the bluecoats that came to kill the Sioux at our end of the village were dead. Only those escaped who were mounted on horses and got across the river. Those who crossed the river got on a high hill to the east, where our young men did not attack them further until after Custer and his men were killed. 200 of the bluecoats lay dead on the field, and our people took their guns and many cartridges, and the morning was in the houses afar off, where the women of the white braves waited to hear of the victory they expected their young men to win. The shadow of the sun had not moved the width of a teepee pole's length from the beginning to the ending of the first fight, and while it was going on, the old man who had shot the buffalo east of the river, and some of the women and children who had been digging Indian turnips and were cut off by the approach of Reno's men came to the camp. They had seen the soldiers of long hair and had heard the firing of Reno's men, and had secreted themselves in the timber along the river until the guns no longer spoke. Down the Greasy Grass River, 3 or 4 miles from where Reno's men had crossed the river, and over across from the camps of the Cheyennes and the Sans Arc, there is an easy crossing of the Greasy Grass. The crossing is near a butte, and around the butte there runs a deep ravine. From Longhair's movements, the Sioux warriors knew that he had planned to strike the camp of my people from the lower end, as Reno struck it from the upper end. Even the women, who knew nothing of warfare, saw that Reno had struck too early, and the warriors, who were generals in planning, even as Longhair was, knew that the white chief would attempt to carry out his plan of the attack, believing that Reno had beaten our young men. There was wild disorder in our camp. The old women and children shrieked and got in the way of the warriors, and the women were ordered back out of the village so that they might not be in the way of our soldiers, and our men went singing down the river, confident that the enemy would be defeated, even as we believed that all of Reno's men had been killed. And I wept with the women for the brave dead, and exulted that our braves should gain a great victory over the whites, led by Longhair, who was the greatest of their chiefs, and whose soldiers could then be plainly seen across the river. From a hill behind the camp at first, and then from the bank of the river, I watched the men of our people plan to overthrow the soldiers of the Great Father. and before a shot was fired I knew that no man who rode with long hair would go back to tell the tale of the fight that would begin when the soldiers approached the river at the lower end of the village. The storyteller paused, and was then asked the question, where was Sitting Bull during the fight? She went on as though she had not heard the question. From across the river I could hear the music of the bugle, and could see the column of soldiers turn to the left to march down to the river to where the attack was to be made. All I could see was the warriors of my people. They rushed like the wind through the village, going down the ravine, as the women went out to the grazing ground to round up the ponies. It was done very quickly. There had been no council the night before. There was no need for one, nor had there been a scalp dance, nothing but the merry making of the young men and the maidens. When we did not know there was to be a fight, we could not be prepared for it, and our camp was not pitched anticipating a battle. The warriors would not have picked out such a place for a fight with white men, open to attack from both ends and from the west side. No, what was done that day was done while the sun stood still, and the white men were delivered into the hands of the Sioux, but no plan was necessary. Our chiefs and the young men rode quickly down to the end of the village, opposite to the hill upon which there now stands the great stone put up by the whites where Long Hair fell. Between that hill and the soldiers was a ravine, which started from the river opposite the camp of the Sans Arc, and ran all the way across the butte. To get to the butte, Long Hair must cross the ravine, but from where he was marching with his soldiers he could not see into the ravine nor down to the banks of the river. The warriors of my people, of all the bands, the Sans Arc, the Cheyenne, the Brule, the Minneconjou, the Okalala, the Blackfeet, all had joined with the Hunkpapa on our side of the greasy grass and opposite the opening into the ravine. Soon I saw a number of Cheyennes ride into the river, then some young men of my band, then others, until there were hundreds of warriors in the river and running up into the ravine. When some hundreds had passed the river and gone into the ravine, the others, who were left, still a very great number, moved back from the river and waited for the attack. And I knew that the fighting men of the Sioux, many hundreds in number, were hidden in the ravine behind the hill upon which Long Hair was marching, and he would be attacked from both sides. And my heart was sad for the soldiers of Long Hair, though they sought the lives of our men. But I was a woman of the Sioux, and my husband, my uncles and cousins and brothers, all taking part in the battle, were men who could fight and plan, and I was satisfied. Pizzey, Gall, and many of his young men had recrossed the Greasy Grass River after the white men had been driven off or killed in the earlier engagement at the upper end of the village, where he, with some of our warriors, had been shooting at the soldiers who were chased to the hill, and the soldiers had been shooting at them, but could not hit the Sioux. When Pizzey, Gall, recrossed the river, many women followed his party, and we heard him tell his men to frighten the horses of the soldiers, which were held in small bunches. With shoutings that we could hear across the river, the young men stampeded the horses, and the women captured them and brought them to the village. The Indians fought the soldiers with bullets taken from the first party that attacked their village, and many rode the horses captured from the white men who had fled to the hill. To the northwest, a great many women and children were driving in the ponies of the Sioux, but I remained with many other women along the bank of Greasy Grass River. I saw Crazy Horse lead the Cheyennes into the water and up the ravine. Crow King and the Hunkpapa went after them, and then Gall, who had led his young men and killed the soldiers he had been fighting farther up the river, rode along the beach by the river to where Long Hair had stopped with his men. I cannot remember the time when men fight, and the air is filled with bullets, when the screaming of horses that are shot drowns the war whoop of the warriors. A woman whose husband and brothers are in the battle does not think of the time. But the sun was no longer overhead when the war whoop of the Sioux sounded from the river bottom and the ravine surrounding the hill at the end of the ridge where Long Hair had taken his last stand. The river was in sight from the butte, and while the whoop still rung in our ears and the women were shrieking, 2 Cheyennes tried to cross the river, and one of them was shot and killed by Long Hair's men. Then the men of the Sioux nation, led by Crow King, Hump, Crazy Horse, and many great chiefs, rose up on all sides of the hill, and the last we could see from our side of the river was a great number of gray horses. The smoke of the shooting and the dust of the horses shut out the hill, and the soldiers fired many shots, but the Sioux shot straight, and the soldiers fell dead. The women crossed the river after the men of our village. When we came to the hill, there were no soldiers living, and Long Hair lay dead among the rest. There were more than 200 dead soldiers on the hill, and the boys of the village shot many who were already dead, for the blood of the people was hot and their hearts bad, and they took no prisoners that day. The woman sat playing with the edge of her blanket of the dreadful things that took place on the hill after the command of the unfortunate Custer had been annihilated. She would, of course, say nothing. The women of her nation finished the work of the warriors on that awful field. I asked her if there was any more fighting. Not much. The men on the hill, Renos, were safe to stay there until they wanted water. Gall kept his men along the river. Some of the soldiers were shot as they tried to reach the water. There was some fighting too, but none of our young men were killed. That night the Sioux, men, women, and children, lighted many fires and danced. Their hearts were glad, for the Great Spirit had given them a great victory. All along the valley of the greasy grass, fires were lighted, and the women laughed as they labored hard to bring in the fuel, for in the darkness they could see the gleam of the flames on the arms of the soldiers fastened in a trap on Reno Hill. The people had taken many guns, cartridges, horses, and much clothing from the soldiers, and they rejoiced while the fires lit up the field on the hill across the river where the naked bodies of the soldiers lay. We had much money, but did not know at the time what its real value was, and a lot of green paper money was kept in my teepee for some time before being disposed of. All night the people danced and sang their songs of victory, and they were strong in their might and would have attacked the soldiers who lay through the night on what you call Reno Hill, but Gall and Crow King and Crazy Horse would waste no lives of the Sioux braves. They said, "We will shoot at them occasionally, but not charge. They will fall into our hands when the thirst burns in their throats and makes them mad for drink." This was the counsel of the chiefs, and the young men saw that it was good. So while many feasted, a few held the hill, and the soldiers did not know it, for of those who stole to the river to drink, none went back alive. There was fighting the next day, but the Sioux knew early in the day that many soldiers were coming up from the north, and preparations were made to leave for new hunting grounds. And while our hearts were singing for the victory our braves had won, there were wailing women in the village, for they had their dead. Since the Sioux first fought the men who are our friends now, they had not won so great a battle and at so little cost. 22 dead were counted, and the price was not great. But what wife or mother or sister gives thought to victory when she finds her dead on the field? So it was that in the midst of the rejoicing there was sorrowing among the women, who would not be comforted in knowing that their dead had gone to join the ghosts of the brave. The dead we took with us laid on travois and carried for many days, for among the white men were Crow and Shoshone scouts who would desecrate our dead, and we would have no Sioux scalps dangling at their teepee poles. So we went out from Greasy Grass River and left Long Hair and his dead to their friends. The people scattered, and the pursuit did not harm us, but I still remember the bitterness of the suffering of the Sioux that winter after we had met and talked with Bear Coat, General Miles, on the Yellowstone, when we were on our way north into the land of the Redcoats, where we remained 5 winters and were frequently very destitute while we remained there. So it was that the Sioux defeated Long Hair and his soldiers in the valley of the Greasy Grass River, which my people remember with regret, but without shame. We are now living happily and in friendship with the whites, knowing that their hearts are good toward us. The great chiefs who led that fight are dead. Gall, Crow King, Crazy Horse, Big Road, and the other head men are dead and gone to the land of ghosts. But their deeds live, and we of the Sioux nation keep them in our memories, even as we keep in remembrance Long Hair and his men, whose bravery in battle makes the bravery of their conquerors a thing that cannot be buried in the grave, nor forgotten, because their ghosts are at peace. And Mrs. Spotted Hornbull put the corner of her shawl to her face and wiped away a tear, forced perhaps by the thought that the husband of her youth, whom she has not forgotten, though she has had many offers from chief men of her people, was with the ghosts of those others who fought with and against him on that June day 33 years ago in the valley of the Little Big Horn. End of section 93. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 94 of the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in November 2020. The World's Story, Volume 13, The United States. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 94. The Temecula Valley, an American Grand Prix, 1869, by Helen Hunt Jackson. Most of the original Mexican grants included tracts of land on which Indians were living, sometimes large villages of them. In many of these grants, in accordance with the old Spanish law or custom, was incorporated a clause protecting the Indians. They were to be left undisturbed in their homes. The portion of the grant occupied by them did not belong to the grantee in any such sense as to entitle him to eject them. The land on which they were living, and the land they were cultivating at the time of the grant, belonged to them as long as they pleased to occupy it. In many of the grants, the boundaries of the Indians' reserved portion of the property were carefully marked off, and the instances were rare in which Mexican grantees disturbed or in any way interfered with Indians living on their estates. There was no reason why they should. There was plenty of land and to spare, and it was simply a convenience and an advantage to have a skilled and docile Indian laborer on the ground. But when the easy-going, generous, improvident Mexican needed or desired to sell his grant, and the sharp American was on hand to buy it, then was brought to light the helplessness of the Indian's position. What cared the sharp American for that sentimental clause, "without injury to the Indians"? Not a farthing. Why should he? His government before him had decided that all the lands belonging to the old missions, excepting the small portions technically held as church property and therefore out of commerce, were government lands. None of the Indians living on those lands at the time of the American possession were held to have any right, not even color of right, to them. That they and their ancestors had been cultivating them for 3/4 of a century made no difference. Americans wishing to preempt claims on any of these so-called government lands did not regard the presence on them of Indian families or communities as any more of a barrier than the presence of so many coyotes or foxes. They would not hesitate to certify the land office that such lands were unoccupied. Still less, then, need the purchaser of tracts covered by old Mexican grants hold himself bound to regard the poor cumberers of the ground, who, having no legal right whatever, had been all their years living on the tolerance of a silly, good-hearted Mexican proprietor. The American wanted every rod of his land, every drop of water on it. His schemes were boundless, his greed insatiable. He had no use for Indians. His plan did not embrace them, and could not enlarge itself to take them in. They must go. This is, in brief, the summing up of the way in which has come about the present pitiable state of the California mission Indians. In some instances, whole villages of them had been driven off at once by fraudulently procured and fraudulently enforced claims. One of the most heartrending of these cases was that of the Temecula Indians. The Temecula Valley lies in the northeast corner of San Diego County. It is watered by 2 streams and has a good soil. It was an appanage of the San Luis Rey Mission, and the 200 Indians who were living there were the children and grandchildren of San Luis Rey neophytes. The greater part of the valley was under cultivation. They had cattle, horses, sheep. In 1865, a special agent of the United States government held a grand Indian convention there. 18 villages were represented, and the numbers of inhabitants, stock, vineyards, orchards were reported. The Indians were greatly elated at this evidence of the government's good intentions toward them. They set up a tall liberty pole, and bringing forth a United States flag, which they had kept carefully hidden away ever since the beginning of the Civil War, they flung it out to the winds in token of their loyalty. "It is astonishing," says one of the San Diego newspapers of the day, that these Indians have behaved so well, considering the pernicious teachings they have had from the secessionists in our midst. There was already anxiety in the minds of the Temecula Indians as to their title to their lands. All that was in existence to show that they had any was the protecting clause in an old Mexican grant. To be sure, the man was still alive who had assisted in marking off the boundaries of their part of this original Temecula grant, but his testimony could establish nothing beyond the letter of the clause as it stood. They earnestly implored the agent to lay the case before the Interior Department. Whether he did or not, I do not know, but this is the sequel. On April 15, 1869, an action was brought in the District Court in San Francisco by 5 men against Andrew Johnson, Thaddeus Stevens, Horace Greeley, and 1,000 Indians and other parties whose names are unknown. It was a bill to quiet title, an action to recover possession of certain real estate bounded thus and thus. It included the Temecula Valley. It was based on grants made by Governor Michael Torina in 1844. The defendants cited were to appear in court within 20 days. The Indians appealed to the Catholic bishop to help them. He wrote to one of the judges an imploring letter saying, "Can you not do something to save these poor Indians from being driven out?" But the scheme had been too skillfully plotted. There was no way, or at any rate no way was found, of protecting the Indians. The day came when a sheriff, bringing a posse of men and a warrant which could not be legally resisted, arrived to eject the Indian families from their houses and drive them out of the valley. The Indians' first impulse was as determined as it could have been if they had been white, to resist the outrage. But on being reasoned with by friends, who sadly and with shame explained to them that by thus resisting they would simply make it the duty of the sheriff to eject them by force, and, if necessary, shoot down any who opposed the executing of his warrant, they submitted. But they refused to lift hand to the moving. They sat down, men and women, on the ground, and looked on, some wailing and weeping, some dogged and silent, while the sheriff and his men took out of the neat little adobe houses their small stores of furniture, clothes, and food, and piled them on wagons to be carried. Where? Anywhere the exiles chose, so long as they did not chance to choose a piece of any white man's land. A Mexican woman is now living in that Temecula valley who told me the story of this moving. The facts I had learned before from records of one sort and another. But standing on the spot, looking at the ruins of the little adobe houses and the walled graveyard full of graves, and hearing this woman tell how she kept her doors and windows shut and could not bear to look out while the deed was being done, I realized how different a thing is history seen from history read. It took 3 days to move them. Procession after procession, with cries and tears, walked slowly behind the wagons carrying their household goods. They took the tule roofs off the little houses and carried them along. They could be used again. Some of these Indians, wishing to stay as near as possible to their old home, settled in a small valley, only 3.5 miles away to the south. It was a dreary, hot little valley, bare, with low, rocky buttes cropping out on either side, and with scanty growths of bushes. There was not a drop of water in it. Here the exiles went to work again, built their huts of reeds and straw, set up a booth of boughs for the priest when he came to say mass in, and a rude wooden cross to consecrate their new graveyard on a stony hillside. They put their huts on barren knolls here and there, where nothing could grow. On the tillable land they planted wheat or barley or orchards, some patches not 10 feet square, the largest not over 3 or 4 acres. They hollowed out the base of one of the rocky buttes, sunk a well there, and found water. I think none of us who saw the little refugee village will ever forget it. The whole place was a series of pictures, and knowing its history, we found in each low roof and paling the dignity of heroic achievement. Near many of the huts stood great round baskets woven of twigs, reaching halfway up to the eaves and looking like huge birds' nests. These were their granaries, holding acorns and wheat. Women with red pottery jars on their heads and on their backs were creeping about, bent over, carrying loads of faggots that would have seemed heavy for a donkey. Aged women sitting on the ground were diligently plaiting baskets, too busy or too old to give more than a passing look at us. A group of women was at work, washing wool in great stone bowls, probably hundreds of years old. The interiors of some of the houses were exquisitely neat and orderly, with touching attempts at adornment, pretty baskets and shelves hanging on the walls, and over the beds canopies of bright calico. On some of the beds the sheets and pillow-cases were trimmed with white hand-wrought lace, made by the Indian women themselves. This is one of their arts which date back to the mission days. Some of the lace is beautiful and fine, and of patterns like the old church laces. It was pitiful to see the poor creatures in almost every one of the hovels bringing out a yard or two of their lace to sell, and there was hardly a house which had not the lace-maker's frame hanging on the wall, with an unfinished piece of lace stretched in it. The making of this lace requires much time and patience. It is done by first drawing out all the lengthwise threads of a piece of fine linen or cotton. Then the threads which are left are sewed over and over into an endless variety of intricate patterns. Sometimes the whole design is done in solid buttonhole stitch, or solid figures are filled in on an open network made of the threads. The baskets were finely woven, of good shapes and excellent decorative patterns in brown and black on yellow or white. Every face except those of the very young was sad beyond description. They were stamped indelibly by generations of suffering, immovable distrust also underlying the sorrow. It was hard to make them smile. To all our expressions of goodwill and interest, they seemed indifferent, and received in silence the money we paid them for baskets and lace. The word Temecula is an Indian word, signifying grief or mourning. It seems to have had a strangely prophetic fitness for the valley to which it was given. End of section 94.
Section 95 of the United States. Read for LibriVox.org by Piotr Mater. The United States, Volume 2, Part 14, The Spanish War. Historical Note. The Spanish rule in Cuba was so harsh that the Cubans tried many times to win their freedom. In 1895 they revolted again and fought with the utmost desperation. Spain could not suppress the revolt, but she treated all Cubans who fell into her hands with the greatest cruelty. On grounds of common humanity, and also to protect American interests in the island, the United States was feeling the necessity of interference when the Maine was blown up in the harbour of Havana. The belief that Spain was privy to the deed aroused the whole country to wrath, and in 1895 war against Spain was declared. The first blow was struck in the Philippines by Commodore Dewey, who steamed into the harbour of Manila and destroyed 10 Spanish warships and 1 transport without the loss of a man. Spain then sent a fleet across the Atlantic. The vessels went into Santiago de Cuba for coal and were promptly bottled up, and American troops were sent to capture the town. When the Spanish fleet attempted to leave the bottle, the ships were destroyed by the American warships. By this battle, Spain lost property valued at $13 million. She had no more warships, and without them she could not hold island possessions. Santiago was surrendered. Puerto Rico was also given up, and in July Spain asked for peace, agreeing to free Cuba and to surrender Puerto Rico to the Americans, as well as Guam, a small island in the Ladrones. The Philippines she sold to the United States for $20 million. By this war of 113 days, Spain lost all her possessions in the West Indies and in the Pacific Ocean, and owns no longer a foot of the land in the western world which her mariners discovered 4 centuries ago. End of section 95.
Section 96 of the United States. Read for LibriVox.org by Alan Mapstone. Cuba to Colombia by Will Carleton. April 1896. A voice went over the waters, a stormy edge of the sea. Fairest of freedom's daughters, have you no help for me? Do you not hear the rusty chain clanking about my feet? Have you not seen my children slain, whether in cell or street? Oh, if you were sad as I, and I as you were strong, you would not have to call or cry, you would not suffer long. Patience, have I not learned it, under the crushing years? Freedom, have I not earned it, toiling with blood and tears? Not of you my banners wave, not on Egyptian shore, or by Armenia's mammoth grave, but at your very door. Oh, if you were needy as I, and I as you were strong, you should not suffer, bleed and die, under the hooves of wrong. Is it that you have never felt the oppressor's hand, fighting with fond endeavour to cling to your own sweet land? Were you not half dismayed, there in the century's night, till to your view a sister's aid came like a flash of light? Oh, what gift could ever be grand, enough to pay the debt, if out of the starry western land should come my Lafayette? End of section 96. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 97 of the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. The World's Story, Volume 13, The United States. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 97. The Sinking of the Maine. 1898. By Willis J. Abbott. Humanitarian considerations, rather than regard for imperiled interests, brought the United States into a war which most emphatically their people did not desire. The great New York newspapers, day by day, printed circumstantial accounts of the frightful sufferings in Cuba. One journal secured a large number of photographs of scenes among the starving reconcentrados, which, greatly enlarged, were publicly exhibited in all parts of the Union. These pictures, showing the frightful distortions of the human body as the result of long starvation, showing little children, mere skeletons, looking mutely down on the dead bodies of their parents, brought home to the mind of the people the state of life in a neighboring land as no writing, however brilliant, could. A cry went up from every part of the United States that a Christian duty was imposed upon our nation to interfere for the alleviation of such horrible suffering. Charity came to the rescue with free contributions of provisions, and Congress made a heavy appropriation of money for the relief of the Cubans. But everywhere the opinion grew that philanthropy alone could not right this great wrong, but that the strong hand of the United States must reach forth to pluck out the Spaniard from the land he ravaged. And when a number of senators and representatives in Congress made journeys to Cuba, and returning, described in formal addresses at the Capitol the scenes of starvation and misery, this opinion hardened into positive conviction. Then, almost as if planned by some all-knowing power, came a great and inexplicable disaster, which made American intervention inevitable and immediate. During the latter years of the Cleveland administration, the representatives of American interests in Cuba urged that a United States ship of war should be permanently stationed in Havana Harbor. The request was reasonable, the act in thorough accord with the custom of nations. But, fearing to offend Spain, President Cleveland avoided taking the step, and President McKinley for months imitated him. In time this act, which in itself could have no hostile significance, came to be regarded as an expression of hostility to Spain, and all the resources of Spanish diplomacy were exerted to prevent any American warship from entering Havana harbor. Ultimately, however, the pressure of public opinion compelled the executive to provide for representation of American authority in the disordered island, and the battleship Maine, a sister ship to the Iowa, was sent to Havana. The night of February 15th, the Maine lay quietly at her anchorage in Havana harbor. Her great white hull, with lights shining brilliantly from the ports aft, where the officers' quarters were, gleamed in the starlight. On the berth deck the men swung sleeping in their hammocks. The watch on deck breathed gratefully the cool evening air after the long tropic day. Captain Sigsbee was at work in his cabin, and the officers in the wardroom were chatting over their games or dozing over their books. The lights of the town and of the ancient fortress of Morro shone brightly through the purpling light. Not far away the Spanish man-of-war Alfonso XIII lay at her moorings, and an American merchantman, brightly lighted, was near. The scene was peaceful, quiet, beautiful, true in the minds of many officers, and the men on the American warship there was a lurking and indefinable sense of danger. Their coming had been taken by the Spaniards in Havana as a hostile act, though all the perfunctory requirements of international courtesy had been complied with. Salutes interchanged, visits of ceremony paid and returned. There was yet in the Spanish greeting an ill-concealed tone of anger. In the cafes, Spanish officers cursed the Yankees and boasted of their purpose to destroy them. On the streets, American bluejackets, on shore leave, were jostled, jeered, and insulted. Yet the ill temper of the Spaniards, though apparent, was so ill-defined that no apprehension of a positive attack was felt, as in the practice on men of war. However, the utmost vigilance was maintained. Only the employment of a boat patrol and the use of torpedo nettings were lacking to give the Maine the aspect of a ship in an enemy's harbor. Then came the disaster that shocked the world, a disaster in which it is impossible not to suspect the element of treachery, a disaster which, if purely accidental, occurring to a hated ship in a port surrounded by men who were enemies at heart, was the most extraordinary coincidence in history. This much we know. At about 9:30, those on the Maine who lived to tell the tale heard a sudden dull explosion, with a slight shock, then a prolonged deep, furious roar, which shook the ship to its very vitals. The people on the other side in the harbor saw the whole forward portion of the Maine suddenly become a flaming volcano, belching forth fire, men, huge pieces of steel, and bursting shells. Portions of the ship's hull rained down on decks 1,000 yards away. When the first fierce shock of the explosion was past, it was seen that the Maine was on fire and was rapidly sinking. How wonderful is the power of discipline on the human mind! On the great battleship, with hundreds of its men blown to pieces or pinned down by steel debris to be drowned in the rapidly rising waters, there was no panic. Captain Sigsbee, rushing from his cabin door, is met by the sergeant of marines, who serves him as orderly. Not a detail of naval etiquette is lacking. Sergeant William Anthony salutes. "I have to report, sir, that the ship is blown up and is sinking," he says, as he would report a pilot boat in the offing. The captain reaches the deck to find his officers already at work, the men who have not been injured all at their stations. Boats are lowered and ply about the harbor to rescue survivors. Though the flames rage fiercely, and the part of the ship which they have not yet reached is full of high explosives, there is no panic. At the first alarm every man has done what years of drill and teaching have taught him to do. The after magazines have been flooded, the boat's crews called away. Even preparations for a fight had been attempted. Lieutenant Jenkins, hearing the first explosion, sprang so quickly for his station at a forward gun that he was caught in the second explosion and slain. Though a bolt from heaven or a shock from hell had struck the main, it brought death only, not fear nor panic. The work of rescuing survivors and caring for the wounded was pushed apace, for the ship sunk rapidly, until only her after superstructure was above the waters. Boats from the Spanish man-of-war joined in the work of mercy, and her officers, as though conscious that the suspicion of treachery was first in every man's mind, exerted themselves in every way to show solicitude for the wounded and sorrow for the disaster. When all was done that could be done, and the roll of the ship's company was called, it was found that 266 brave Americans were lost in Havana Harbor, a friendly port. After the raising of the main, the American Board of Inquiry found that the destruction was caused by the explosion of a low form of explosive exterior to the ship. On March 16, 1912, the remains of the vessel were towed out to sea and sunk with all naval honors. The bodies of the crew which had been recovered were buried in the National Cemetery at Arlington. The Editor. End of section 97. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 98 of the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Meg Huskin. The World Story, Volume 13, The United States. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 98. The Battle of Santiago, 1898. From the account of a newspaper correspondent. The following graphic account of this battle was written by a newspaper correspondent who was aboard the American battleship Texas during the encounter. The Editor. Almost before the leading ship was clear of the shadow of Morro Castle, the fight had begun. Admiral Cervera started it by a shell from the Almirante Oquendo, to which he had transferred his flag. It struck none of the American vessels. In a twinkling, the big guns of the Texas belched forth their thunder, which was followed immediately by a heavy fire from our other ships. The Spaniards turned to the westward under full steam, pouring a constant fire on our ships, and evidently hoping to get away by their superior speed. The Texas, still heading inshore, kept up a hot exchange of shots with the foremost ships, which gradually drew away to the westward under the shadow of the hills. The third of the Spanish vessels, the Vizcaya, or Infanta Maria Teresa, was caught by the Texas in good fighting range, and it was she that engaged the chief attention of the first battleship commissioned in the American Navy. The Texas steamed west with her adversary, and as she could not catch her with speed, she did with her shells. The din of the guns was so terrific that orders had to be yelled close to the messenger's ears, and at times the smoke was so thick that absolutely nothing could be seen. Once or twice, the 12-inch guns in the turrets were swung across the ship and fired. The concussion shook the great vessel, as though she had been struck by a great ball, and everything movable was splintered. The men near the guns were thrown flat on their faces. Meanwhile, the Oregon had come in on the run. She passed the Texas and chased after the Commodore Schley on the Brooklyn to head off the foremost of the Spanish ships. The Iowa also turned her course westward and kept up a hot fire on the running enemy. At 10 o'clock, the third of the Spanish ships, the one that had been exchanging compliments with the Texas, was seen to be on fire, and a mighty cheer went up from our ships. The Spaniard headed for the shore, and the Texas turned her attention to the one following. The Brooklyn and the Oregon, after a few parting shots, also left her contemptuously, and made all steam and shell after the foremost two of the Spanish ships, the Almirante Oquendo and the Cristobal Colon. Just then, the two torpedo boat destroyers Pluton and Furor were discovered. They had come out after the cruisers without being seen, and were boldly heading west down the coast. "All small guns on the torpedo boats," was the order on the Texas, and in an instant a hail of shot was pouring all about them. A 6-pounder from the starboard battery of the Texas, under Ensign Guise, struck the foremost torpedo boat fairly in the boiler. A rending sound was heard above the roar of the battle. A great spout of black smoke shot up from the destroyer, and she was out of commission. The Iowa, which was coming up fast, threw a few complimentary shots at the second torpedo boat destroyer and passed on. The little Gloucester, formerly a yacht, then sailed in and finished the second boat. Gun for gun and shot for shot, the running fight was kept up between the Spanish cruisers and the 4 American vessels. At 10:30 o'clock, the Infanta Maria Teresa and Vizcaya were almost on the beach and were evidently in distress. As the Texas was firing at them, a white flag was run up on the one nearest her. "Cease firing," called Captain Phillip, and a moment later both the Spaniards were beached. Clouds of black smoke arose from each, and bright flashes of flame could be seen shining through the smoke. Boats were visible, putting out from the cruisers to the shore. The Iowa waited to see that the 2 warships were really out of the fight, and it did not take her long to determine that they would never fight again. The Iowa herself had suffered some very hard knocks. The Brooklyn, Oregon, and Texas pushed ahead after the Colon and Almirante Oquendo, which were now running the race of their lives along the coast. At 10:50 o'clock, when Admiral Cervera's flagship, the Almirante Oquendo, suddenly headed inshore, she had the Brooklyn and Oregon abeam, and the Texas astern. The Brooklyn and Oregon pushed on after the Cristobal Colon, which was making fine time, and which looked as if she might escape, leaving the Texas to finish the Almirante Oquendo. This work did not take long. The Spanish ship was already burning. At 11:05 o'clock, down came a yellow and red flag at her stern. Just as the Texas got abeam of her, she was shaken by a mighty explosion. The crew of the Texas started to cheer. "Don't cheer! The poor devils are dying," called Captain Phillip, and the Texas left the Almirante Oquendo to her fate to join in the chase of the Cristobal Colon. That ship, in desperation, was plowing the waters at a rate that caused the fast Brooklyn trouble. The Oregon made great speed for a battleship, and the Texas made the effort of her life. Never since her trial trip had she made such time. The Brooklyn might have proved a match to the Cristobal Colon in speed, but she was not supposed to be her match in strength. It would never do to allow even one of the Spanish ships to get away. Straight into the west, the strongest chase of modern times took place. The Brooklyn headed the pursuers. She stood well out from the shore in order to try to cut off the Cristobal Colon at a point jutting out into the sea far ahead. The Oregon kept a middle course, about a mile from the cruiser. The desperate Don ran close along the shores, and now and then he threw a shell of defiance. The old Texas kept well up in the chase, under the forced draft, for over 2 hours. The fleet Spaniard led the Americans a merry chase, but she had no chance. The Brooklyn gradually forged ahead so that the escape of the Cristobal Colon was cut off at the point above mentioned. The Oregon was abeam of the Colon then, and the gallant Don gave it up. At 1:15 o'clock, he headed for the shore, and 5 minutes later down came the Spanish flag. None of our ships was then within a mile of her, but her escape was cut off. The Texas, Oregon, and Brooklyn closed in on her and stopped their engines a few hundred yards away. Commodore Schley left the Brooklyn in a small boat and went aboard the Cristobal Colon and received the surrender. Meantime, the New York, with Admiral Sampson on board, and the Vixen were coming up on the run. Commodore Schley signaled to Admiral Sampson, "We have won a great victory. Details will be communicated." Then, for an hour after the surrender, in that little cove under the high hills, was a general 4th of July celebration, though a little premature. Our ships cheered one another, the captains indulged in compliments through the megaphones, and the Oregon got out its band, and the strains of the Star-Spangled Banner echoed over the lines of the Spaniards, drawn up on the deck of the last of the Spanish fleet, and up over the lofty green-tipped hills of the Cuban mountains. End of section 98. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Meg Huskin. Section 99 of the United States. Read for LibriVox.org by Meg Huskin. The Charge at El Caney by Frank T. Merrill. Painting page 488. While the Spanish fleet under Cervera was shut into the harbor of Santiago, it was decided to capture the town with a land force, and on the morning of July 1st, a general attack was made against the Spanish entrenchments on the heights of El Caney and San Juan. El Caney was held by about 500 Spaniards, who made a gallant stand against a force of nearly 10 times their number, and did not retreat until more than half of them were killed or captured. Quote, "The attacking force was composed entirely of regulars, with the exception of the 2nd Massachusetts Regiment in Ludlow's brigade. These volunteers, never in action before, behaved extremely well, coming up steadily under fire and taking their places in the firing line. But the moment they opened with their archaic Springfields and black powder, which they owed to the narrow parsimony of Congress, and to the lack of energy and efficiency in the system of the War Department, they became not only an easy mark for the Spanish Mausers, but made the position of more peril to all the other troops. In consequence of this, they had to be withdrawn from the firing line, but not until they had suffered severely and displayed an excellent courage. The lack of artillery and the black powder made the assault on El Caney a work to which infantry should not have been forced. Yet they were forced to it, and supported by only 4 guns, but splendidly led by Parton, Chaffee, and Ludlow. They carried the position at heavy cost by sheer courage, discipline, and good fighting, manifesting these great qualities in a high degree, and one worthy of very lasting honor and remembrance." End quote. Henry Cabot Lodge. This illustration shows the 2nd Massachusetts Volunteers charging up the hill at El Caney. It is from a painting made under the direction of Colonel Embury P. Clark, Springfield, Massachusetts, commander of the regiment, and is reproduced through the courtesy of Mr. C. W. Gersh of New York City, holder of the copyright. End of section 99. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 100 of the United States. Read for LibriVox.org by Thomas Peter. The Flag Goes By Henry Holcomb Bennett. Hats off! Along the street there comes a blare of bugles, a ruffle of drums, a flash of colour beneath the sky. Hats off! The flag is passing by. Blue and crimson and white it shines, over the steel-tipped ordered lines. Hats off! The colours before us fly, but more than the flag is passing by. Sea fights and land fights, grim and great, fought to make and to save the state. Weary marches and sinking ships, cheers of victory on dying lips. Days of plenty and years of peace, march of a strong land's swift increase, equal justice, right and law, stately honour and reverend awe. Sign of a nation great and strong, to ward her people from foreign wrong. Pride and glory and honour, all live in the colours to stand or fall. Hats off! Along the street there comes a blare of bugles, a ruffle of drums, and loyal hearts are beating high. Hats off! The flag is passing by. End of section 100. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 101 of the United States, read for LibriVox.org. The United States, Volume 2, Part 15, The 20th Century, Historical Note. The history of the first part of the 20th century is almost startling in the rapid progress which it records. The numbers of discoveries and inventions which have reached their highest development and have come into general use within the 20th century are countless. Comfort, convenience, and the extension of trade have been sought in numerous ways. Irrigation has enlarged the amount of arable land in the United States. Pure food laws have made this country a more desirable place to live in and have given promise to its people of longer and more healthy lives. Facilities for transportation of things and people have greatly increased. The parcel post has at last been introduced. The functions of the Red Cross have broadened until it is looked to as the first friend in any kind of public calamity. Aviation has made amazing progress. The Panama Canal has been built. The various applications of electricity, electric cars, the telephone, wireless telegraphy, etc., have become necessities of everyday life, and by no means should the little conveniences be forgotten, tiny but most valuable aids to comfort and safety. Younger folk take all these things as a matter of course. Older ones look at them half wonderingly and peer forward in imagination to the 21st century, thinking of the power, the resources, and the problems of the country, but confident that a solution of the problems will be found and that the power and resources will work for the happiness and the best good of those who will then be the people of the United States and citizens of the blessed land of room enough. End of section 101. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 102 of the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. The World's Story, Volume 13, The United States. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 102, The Romance of the Reindeer, 1905. By Mary Gay Humphreys. Something was known of the Alaskan coast in the 16th century, and during the 18th it was visited by explorers of Russian, English, and other nationalities. Russian colonies developed the fur trade, but as furs decreased, the country was looked upon as of small value, and when the United States in 1867 bought Russian America, as it was then called, and paid $7,200,000, it was regarded by many as an exceedingly foolish purchase. The Russians knew that both gold and copper existed in the land, but they made no attempt to develop the minerals, and even after the country came into the hands of the United States, there was for many years only a very moderate amount of mining done. In 1896, gold was found in the Canadian Klondike, and soon after in several different parts of Alaska, and in a few months the lonely northern country was full of eager miners. In 1898 there were more than 40,000 persons in the Klondike region alone, and in a single year the gold mines of this "worthless land of ice and snow" yielded more than double its purchase price. In order that the agricultural possibilities of Alaska might be developed and the vast mineral wealth made accessible, Congress in 1914, at the recommendation of President Wilson, appropriated $40 million for the construction of a railroad into the interior. The Editor. A mistress went to Castle Garden, when that was a port of entry, for a maid. She found a demure little Swede. "Can you cook?" the mistress asked. "No, ma'am." "Can you sweep and make beds?" "No, ma'am." "What then can you do?" she asked in desperation. "I can milk reindeer, ma'am." In that day, to come to this country to milk reindeer was like going to Tahiti to cut ice. Now you can cut ice in Tahiti, and there are thousands of reindeer in this country waiting to be milked, and prepared to furnish butter and cheese, and perform duties which they alone can perform. The civilization of Alaska by reindeer is one of the prettiest tales ever told of imagination justified by experience, one of the most convincing stories of the glance of the prophetic eye fully and speedily realized. It is also the story of discouragement, ridicule, persistence against overwhelming odds, and, what is more difficult, of the combat with skepticism, against which only the most enlivening faith, undaunted hope, and unconquerable energy can make way. Until gold was found in Alaska, it was the neglected stepchild of the country. Except to the missionary and the seal hunters of the coast, the inhabitants of the Arctic Circle had not even a place in the census. The missionary is a curious person. He sees things through the eye of faith, as others see through knowledge. To this trait is due, as so many other vital but unrecognized acts are due, that machinery of the new civilization in Alaska, now so successfully under way. Of this the reindeer is the motive power. It was the missionary that supplied it. In 1890 Dr. Sheldon Jackson, making his inspecting tour among the Alaskan missions, became aware of an impending dangerous situation. The greed of the white man was devastating both land and sea. The whalers had driven the whales to other seas. The walrus was nearly exterminated by steam and rapid-firing guns. The hunted seals no longer played about the coastline. To find them, the native had to go far out to sea. This meant that the inhabitants of northern Alaska were being deprived of their food, their clothing, light, implements, and their industries. Famine was depopulating them, and it was inevitable that the government would soon have thousands of helpless persons dependent on its bounty for food. Across the 30 miles of water we know as Bering's Straits was Siberia, with a people comfortably prosperous and living under almost the same natural conditions. The contrast was too striking not to excite attention and inquiry. To Dr. Jackson the answer seemed to lie in the possession of the Siberians of the domestic reindeer. To the Siberian the reindeer was food, clothing, beast of burden, and article of commerce. The reindeer is prolific. It costs nothing for its keep. Under the vast snowfields of the frozen north lies the reindeer moss on which it feeds. Why then should the reindeer not be to the Alaskan what it is to his neighbour across Bering's Straits? The proposition was so convincing that Dr. Jackson hastened to Washington to lay it before Congress and ask for a small appropriation to buy a few Siberian reindeer for the present emergency, and in the belief that they would secure Alaska against future catastrophes. To Congress this was only one of those rainbow schemes for which it is so often called upon to provide. Senator Teller, indeed, urged the appropriation, but his voice was lost in this handsome opportunity for oratorical satire and senatorial puns. Dr. Jackson did not get his appropriation, but a sufficient number of outside people were interested in the project to subscribe $2,000 as a venture, and the government did allow the revenue cutter Thetis to take Dr. Jackson to Siberia to make his purchases. But the Siberians did not want to sell. The Thetis sailed 1,500 miles before an owner could be found willing to part with his deer. Money he refused. What were bits of metal to him? At last he consented to barter for American goods. Thus 16 deer only were secured. This was in 1891, a beginning so insignificant that it attracted no attention. Meanwhile, Senator Teller continued to press the matter on the Senate, and at last senatorial courtesy prevailed. "Teller has this at heart. He only asks $6,000. It is a small sum. Let him have it." So the senators argued, and the first appropriation was made in 1894. In 1897 this was increased to $12,000. In 1900 it was changed to $25,000, and has since continued at this figure. In all, the government has given $183,000 for the propagation and purchase of reindeer for Alaska, with the following results. Today there are 8,000 reindeer in Arctic and subarctic Alaska. Of these the government owns 4,000, and the natives own 4,000. Any one of these is worth for the butcher alone $50. This is to say that, for food merely, the government and the native each have $200,000 in reindeer out of the original investment of $183,000. It would be interesting to know how many of the investments of the government pay as well. Satisfactory as the reindeer have been from a financial point of view, this is the least important result. The reindeer is so prolific that this modest beginnings soon entailed a system of distribution which has since been successfully followed. At first Siberian herders were brought over to care for the herd. To these Eskimos were apprenticed in order to learn the care of the deer, to train and break them to harness. They served 5 years, receiving food and clothes from the government. They were also to have the loan of 2 female deer a year, and to regard these and their fawns as the nucleus of a future herd. After 5 years, if the apprentice was satisfactory, he was to receive a loan of enough deer to bring the number up to 50. As a herder, he was now obliged to supply himself and family, and could take apprentices himself. For 20 years the government exercises supervision over these herders. If a herder should drink, or not take proper care of his herd, he can be dispossessed, and his herd loaned to another person. On his part he agrees not to sell any female deer to any purchaser except the government. Deer were also loaned to the mission station, with the same provisions as to the apprentices and sale, they agreeing to return to the government, when called upon, the original number of deer loaned. One instance alone illustrates the value of these loans to the missions. In 1894 100 deer were loaned to the Congregational Mission at Cape Prince of Wales. Since then the mission has repaid the loan, and now owns 1,000 head of deer. Such ownership means to the mission a permanence it could not otherwise have, since the natives, not being required to go afar for food, escape the demoralization of the mining camps. It also affords an opportunity of encouraging and rewarding worthy native families and promoting their material interests. It affords, moreover, a source of revenue in selling male deer to the miners for food and for transportation. A sledge deer is valued at $150, and is superseding dogs for this purpose. A couple of deer in harness will haul 750 pounds, and find their own food in the reindeer moss beneath the snow. As food, the deer afford a constant supply of fresh meat, which means much to people condemned to live on canned goods the greater part of the year. Of the 60 owners of herds, 2/3 are Eskimos, who have secured their deer through apprenticeship, and have been trusted to become owners. 2 are women, and one of these, with the exception of the mission at Cape Prince of Wales, is the foremost of what will yet come to be the reindeer aristocracy of Alaska, a class corresponding to the great cattle ranchers of the plains. Mary Antisarlook, now Andriuk, owns 358 deer and fawns. A woman who can neither read nor write, she speaks 7 languages, and has been of great service to the government as interpreter. If to her natural abilities as a linguist, woman of affairs, and executive ability, she has had the advantages of education, and been placed outside of the Arctic regions, she would have been, "one of the women of our times." As it is, she is the "reindeer queen of Alaska." This is what the reindeer has done in a few years for the material prosperity of the natives of Alaska. It is but the beginning of the future of the reindeer over a pasturage which will easily accommodate 10 million head, a pasturage of perpetual snow over which no other animal can graze. The reindeer is a timid animal, A sudden movement will put him to flight. Being timid, he is gregarious, and a herder can easily care for 1,000 heads. He is so gentle that, being domesticated, he will eat out of hand and follow like a dog. He is so speedy that Paul de Chaillu tells of travelling 150 miles in a day in a reindeer sledge. A pair can hold 750 pounds and can make 35 miles a day through the unbroken snow, finding their own food, and this for weeks at a time. The colder it is, the better they thrive. It is the reindeer that has transformed the postal facilities of Alaska. There are now semi-monthly mails to the Yukon and Nome during the winter, where before there were none. The longest route is that to Point Barrow, the most northern post office on the globe. Here are a whaling station and a mission that formerly received but one mail a year, and that sometimes failed. Now reindeer carry a winter mail over 1,300 miles without road or trail, the thermometer from 20 to 60 degrees below zero, to that faraway post on the Arctic Ocean. There have been acts of beneficence accomplished through prolonged peril that deserve a place among the records of heroic deeds, which only the presence of the reindeer have made possible. In the autumn of 1897, 8 whalers and 275 men were caught in the ice near Point Barrow, with only 3 months' provision. It would be at least a year before the ice released them, and starvation awaited them. No vessel with food could get within 2,000 miles of them, nor was there any method of transporting food overland. But there were herds of deer at Cape Nome. Responding to a call for volunteers, Lieutenants Jervis and Berthold and Sergeant Cole of the Navy made their way by dog sleds to Cape Nome to the Congregational Mission. Here they secured 500 deer, and aided by W.T. Lopp, the missionary in charge, and Eskimo herders, made their way over the unbeaten snow 750 miles in an Arctic winter, arriving at Point Barrow after a journey of 3 months, just in time to save the starving men. Of the reindeer, 246 were used for food, and the remainder kept to form the nucleus of a herd at Point Barrow to provide against future emergencies. 5 years before this, rescue could not possibly have been effected, and in this case it was due entirely to the prophetic eye which saw what reindeer might be to the frozen north. In 1900, the soldiers employed in building the government telegraph on the Yukon were imprisoned by the winter storms. The rations were failing, and the mules had given out, when word reached a mission station. Dr. Gambrill and an assistant started immediately with deer, and the troops with their camp equipage were brought out in safety. Thereafter the deer were kept with them, meanwhile hauling telegraph poles until the work was done. The discovery of gold and the influx of miners has given a new impetus to the reindeer industry. The miner must be fed, and he must be carried long distances prospecting. A dog team required to go a long distance can carry only its own supplies. With a reindeer team, the miner can haul his own outfit and supplies, and the reindeer feeds himself. The mining interest alone, which in the beginning was not a factor to be considered, has opened an immense field to the reindeer industry, and helped to ensure a livelihood for the Alaskan natives, who bade fair so short a time to be a national charge. The increase of the deer and the ease with which the fawns are cared for, the herds doubling every 3 years, warrant the conservative estimate that in 3 decades there will be 10 million reindeer in Alaska. There are also those who believe that within that time reindeer hams and tongs will be shipped to the United States, helping to feed our population. End of section 102.
Section 103 of the United States, read for LibriVox.org by Sonia. Totem Poles, Alaska. Photograph, page 504. Among many savage nations, there is a belief that certain groups of persons within the tribe are descended from certain animals. There is, then, the tribe of the wolf, the bear, or the turtle, for instance. The animal from which one thinks himself descended is sacred in his eyes, and he treats it with the utmost respect. He will not kill or eat it unless compelled by grievous necessity, and not then without expressing sincere sorrow at having to take the life of one of his friends. The totem is expected to return this allegiance, and even if it is a dangerous animal, it is believed to be harmless to its devoted friends, and even to aid them by every means in its power. Not only are there clan totems, but individuals have their own special totem, to which they must be faithful. In Alaska, the totem is carved upon a great post, which is often brilliantly painted. This post is then set up in front of the house or in the burial place. Sometimes a post is a genealogical record, exhibiting the totems of several generations. End of section 103. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 104 of the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Valerie Marino. The World Story, Volume 13, The United States. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 104. Learning Coal Mining by Joseph Husband. With a view to learning the operating end of soft coal mining, the author of this article on the dangers of the mines, 10 days after graduating from Harvard, took his place in a mine as an unskilled workman. The Editor. To the ear accustomed to the constant sound of a living world, the stillness of a coal mine, where the miles of cross-cuts and entries and the unyielding walls swallow up all sounds and echo, is a silence that is complete, but as one becomes accustomed to the silence through long hours of solitary work, sounds become audible that would escape an ear less trained. The trickling murmur of the gas, the spattering fall of a lump of coal, loosened by some mysterious force from a cranny in the wall, the sudden knocking and breaking of a stratum far up in the rock above, or the scurry of a rat off somewhere in the darkness, strike on the ear loud and startlingly. The eye, too, becomes trained to penetrate the darkness, but the darkness is so complete that there is a limit, the limit of the rays cast by the pit lamp. There is a curious thing that I have noticed, and as I have never heard it mentioned by any of the other men, perhaps it is an idea peculiar to myself, but on days when I entered the mine with the strong yellow sunlight and the blue sky as a last memory of the world above, I carried with me a condition of fair weather that seemed to penetrate down into the blackness of the entries and make my pit lamp burn a little more brightly. On days when we entered the mine with a gray sky above, or with a cold rain beating on our faces, there was a depression of spirits that made the blackness more dense and unyielding, and the lights from the lamps seemed less cheerful. Sometimes the roof was bad in the rooms, and I soon learned from the older miners to enter my room each morning testing gingerly with my pit lamp for the presence of gas, and reaching far up with my pick, tapping on the smooth stone roof as to test its strength. If the steel rang clean against the stone, the roof was good, but if it sounded dull and drummy, it might be dangerous. Sometimes, when the roof was weak, we would call for the section boss and prop up the loosened stone, but more often the men ran their risk. We worked so many days in safety that it seemed strange that death could come, and when it did come, it came so suddenly that there was a surprise, and the next day we began to forget. I had heard much of the dangers that the miner is exposed to, but little has been said of the risks to which the men through carelessness subject themselves. Death comes frequently to the coal miners from a blown-out shot. When the blast is inserted in the drill hole, several dummy cartridges are packed in for tamping. If these are properly made and tamped, the force of the explosion will tear down the coal properly. But if the man has been careless in his work, the tamps will blow out like shot from a gun barrel, and igniting such gas or coal dust as may be present, kill or badly burn the shot firers. The proper tamping is wet clay, but it is impossible to convince the men of it, and 9 out of 10 will tamp their holes with dummies filled with coal dust, itself a dangerous explosive, scooped up from the side of the track. Again, powder kegs are sometimes opened in a manner which seems almost the act of an insane man. Rather than take the trouble to unscrew the cap in the head of the tin powder keg and pour out the powder through its natural opening, A miner will drive his pick through the head of the keg and pour the powder from the jagged square hole he has punched. And these are but two of the many voluntary dangers which little care on the part of the men themselves would obviate. A mine always seems more or less populated when the day shift is down, for during the hours of the working day, in every far corner at the head of every entry and room, there are men drilling, loading, and ever pushing forward its boundaries. At 5 o'clock, the long line of blackened miners, which is formed at the foot of the hoisting shaft, begins to leave the mine, and by 6 o'clock, with the exception of a few inspectors and fire bosses, the mine is deserted. The night shift began at 8, and it was as though night had suddenly been hastened forward to step from the soft evening twilight on the hoist, and in a brief second leave behind the world and the day and plunge back into the darkness of the mine. We were walking up the track from the mine bottom towards 6 West South. Billy Wild, Pat Davis, 2 track repairers, and I. As we turned the corner by the runaround, there came suddenly from far off in the thick stillness a faint tremor and a strong current of air. The shooters were at work. For a quarter of a mile we walked on, stopping every once in a while to listen to the far-off boom of the blast that came through the long tunnels, faint and distant as though muffled by many folds of heavy cloth. We pushed open the big trapper's door just beyond where first and second right turn off from main entry, and came into the faint yellow glow of a single electric lamp that hung from the low-beamed roof. Beside the track, in a black niche cut in the wall of coal, 2 men were working. A safe 20 feet from them their lighted pit lamps flared where they were hung by the hooks from one of the props. Round black cans of powder tumbled together in the back of the alcove. A pile of empty paper tubes and great spools of thick white fuse lay beside them. We sat down on the track at a safe distance from the open powder and watched them as they blew open the long white tubes and with a battered funnel poured in the coarse grains of powder until the smooth round carriage was filled, a yard or 2 of white fuse hanging from its end. In 15 minutes they had finished, and one of the men gathered in his arms the pile of completed cartridges and joined us in the main entry. A few minutes later, as we neared the heading, a sudden singing boom came down strongly against the air current and bent back the flames in our pit lamps. Far off in the blackness ahead, a point of light marked the direction of the tunnel. Another appeared. Suddenly, from the thick silence, came the shrill whine of the air drills. A couple of lamps, like yellow tongues of flame, shone dimly in the head of the tunnel, and the air grew thick with a flurry of fine coal dust. Then below the bobbing lights appeared the bodies of 2 men, stripped to the waist, the black coating of dust that covered them moist with gleaming streaks of sweat. "How many holes have you drilled?" yelled Wild, his voice drowned by the scream of the long air drill as the writhing bit tore into the coal. There was a final convulsive grind as the last inch of the 6-foot drill sank home, then the sudden familiar absence of sound save for the hiss of escaping air. "All done here." Slowly the 2 men pulled the long screw blade from the black breast of the coal, the air hose writhing like a wounded snake about their ankles. The driller who had spoken wiped his sweaty face with his hands, his eyes blinking with the dust. He picked up his greasy coat from beside the track and wrapped it around his wet shoulders. "Look out for the gas," he shouted. "There's a bit here up high." He raised his lamp slowly to the jagged roof. A quick blue flame suddenly expanded from the lamp and puffed down at him as he took away his hand. In the black end of the tunnel, 6 small holes, each 1.5 inches in diameter and 6 feet deep, invisible in the darkness and against the blackness of the coal, marked where the blasts were to be placed. On the level floor stretching from one wall of the entry to the other, the undercut had been ground out with the chain machines by the machine men during the afternoon, and as soon as the blasts were in and the fuses lighted, the sudden wrench of these charges would tear down a solid block of coal 6 feet deep by the height and depth of the entry, to fall crushed and broken into the sump cut, ready for the loaders on the following morning. Selecting and examining each cartridge, the shooters charged the drill holes, 2 cartridges of black powder tamped in with a long copper head rod, then dummies of clay for wads, leaving hanging like a great white cord from each charged drill hole a yard of the long white fuse. We turned and tramped down the tunnel and squatted on the track a safe 50 yards away. Down at the end of the tunnel we had just deserted bobbed the tiny flames of the lights in the shooters' pit caps. There was a faint glow of sparks. "Coming!" they yelled out through the darkness, and we heard them running as we saw their lights grow larger. For a minute we silently waited. Then from the far end of the tunnel, muffled and booming like the breaking of a great wave in some vast cave, came a singing roar, now like the screech of metal hurled through the air, and the black end of the tunnel flamed suddenly defiant, a solid square of crimson flames, like the window of a burning house, and a roar of flying air drove past us, putting out our lights and throwing us back against the rails. "It's a windy one," yelled Wild. "Look out for the rib shots." Like a final curtain in a darkened theater, a slow pall of heavy smoke sank down from the roof, and as it touched the floor, a second burst of flame tore it suddenly upward and far down the entry. The trapper's door banged noisily in the darkness. Then we crept back slowly, breathing hard in an air thick with dust and the smell of burnt black powder, to the end of the tunnel, where the whole face had been torn loose, a great pile of broken coal against the end of the entry. Often bits of paper from the cartridges, lighted by the blast, will start a fire in the piles of coal dust left by the machine men, and before the shooters leave a room that has been blasted, an examination must be made in order to prevent the possibility of fire. All night long we moved from one entry to another, blasting down in each 6 feet more of tunnel, which would be loaded out on the following day, and it was 4 in the morning before the work was finished. It was usually between 4 and 5 in the morning when we left the mine. As we stepped from the hoist and left behind us the confining darkness, the smoky air and the sense of oppression and silence of the mine below, the soft, fresh morning air in the early dawn, or sometimes the cool rain, seemed never more refreshing. One does not notice the silence of a mine so much upon leaving the noise of the outer world and entering the maze of tunnels on a day's work as when stepping off the hoist in the early morning hours when the world is almost still. The sudden sense of sound and of living things emphasizes by contrast the silence of the underworld. There is a noise of life, and the very motion of the air seems to carry sounds. A dog barking half a mile away in the sleeping town sounds loud and friendly, and there seems to be a sudden clamor that is almost bewildering. We were walking down the north entry one early morning and had just passed through the last brattice door when Joe Brass, one of the shop firers, stopped, suddenly alert and silent, and held up his hand. Sound means but little in a mine, and eyes can but rarely detect danger. "Do you smell anything?" he asked. We sniffed the cool air as it fanned past us through the door that we still held open. Almost imperceptible, a curious, foreign odor seemed to hang in the moving current. "Wood smoke," said one of the men. We turned and walked back and closed the door behind us. The smell of the smoke defined itself as we walked forward. Through the next door it hung strong in the air, and with it the oily smell of burning coal. Then a light appeared down the entry, and from its jerky motion we knew that the man was running before we heard his feet clumping over the rough ties. "There's a fire in room 26, he yelled before we could see him. The word had already reached to the bottom, and as we paused at the turning of the entry, trying to see whether to turn to the right or left, there was a sudden roar behind us, and the glow of a locomotive headlight. As we waited, the locomotive came rattling down the tunnel. 6 men crouched low on its black frame, and behind it, on a single flat car, the great steel water tank that was reserved for such emergencies. Shouting questions, we swung on behind. The motor followed the switch and turned sharply down to the right. Through the next door the smoke became suddenly thick, a strong smell, almost as of burning oil, the heavy, pungent smell of soft coal on fire. In the dead air of the entry it hung still and motionless, like yellow fog, and as we jumped off of the truck and ran down the entry behind the locomotive, we crouched low to keep our eyes clear, for there were still a couple of feet of clean air along the bottom of the tunnel. From ahead of us came the sound of voices, and then, through the smoke, we saw the lights of the men, like yellow tongues of flame detached from their bodies, which were hidden in the thick blanket of smoke. The coal in one of the rooms off the main entry, which the shooters had blasted earlier in the night, was on fire, and the heat and smoke were too intense to allow the men to reach it with the water. Shouting at each other in the blinding smoke and darkness, with the dull, steady heat of the invisible fire bringing the sweat in streams from our bodies, we worked to cut off the room from the rest of the mine by building across its broad mouth where it joined the main entry. A solid stopping of wood and plaster. A dozen men in minute relays held a long strip of canvas against the roof, while the rest of us pushed and wedged into place between the floor and the low roof a string of props or posts across the room mouth. As the smoke thickened and the heat grew more intense, the relays became shorter, and we suddenly dived from the dense, choking air above to lie flat along the floor, sucking in the cool, clean air that lay above the water beside the tracks. In half an hour we had erected a long line of posts, with the canvas nailed against it, and a temporary stopping was effected. By that time a dozen of the timbermen had arrived, and motors had dragged up from the mine bottom piles of matched boards and sacks of wood fiber plaster. An hour more and the stopping was reinforced, with a solid fence of boards. And then, mixing the plaster in the water beside the track, and using our hands as trowels, we caulked the seams, the plaster drying quickly against the hot boards. 3 hours later the work was done, and the air current moving steadily down the entry had blown away the last shreds of the thick and choking smoke. In the light of our lamps and lanterns, we again examined the long white wall that we had erected across the room mouth, a few more handfuls of plaster on cracks through which a thin trickle of smoke still puffed outward, and the work was done. 2 months later, when the fire, cut off from the air of the mine, had smothered itself to extinction, the wall was torn down, the gas blown out, and work once more resumed. End of section 104. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Valerie Marino.
Section 105 of the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. The World's Story, Volume 13, The United States. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 105. The Social Value of the Telephone in the United States. By Herbert N. Casson. What we might call the telephonization of city life, for lack of a simpler word, has remarkably altered our manner of living from what it was in the days of Abraham Lincoln. It has enabled us to be more social and cooperative. It has literally abolished the isolation of the separate family. It has become so truly an organ of the social body that we now enter into contracts by telephone, give evidence, try lawsuits, make speeches, propose marriage, confer degrees, appeal to voters, and do almost everything else that is a matter of speech. In stores and hotels this wire traffic has grown to an almost bewildering extent. The 100 largest hotels in New York City have 21,000 telephones, nearly as many as the continent of Africa, and more than the Kingdom of Spain. In an average year they send 6 billion messages. The Waldorf Astoria alone tops all residential buildings with 1,120 telephones and 500,000 calls a year, while merely the Christmas Eve orders that flash into Marshall Field's store or John Wanamaker's have risen as high as 3,000. Whether the telephone concentrates population or scatters it is a question that has not yet been examined. It is certainly true that it has made the skyscraper possible, and thus helped to create an absolutely new type of city that was never imagined even in the fairy tales of ancient nations. The skyscraper is 10 years younger than the telephone. It is now generally admitted to be the ideal building for business offices. It is one of the few types of architecture that may fairly be called American, and its efficiency is largely, if not mainly, due to the fact that its inhabitants may run errands by telephone as well as by elevator. There seems to be no activity which is not being made more convenient by the telephone. It is used to call the duck shooters in Western Canada when a flock of birds has arrived, and to direct the movements of the dragon in Wagner's grand opera Siegfried. At the last Yale-Harvard football game it conveyed the almost instantaneous news to 50,000 people in various parts of New England. At the Vanderbilt Cup race its wires girdled the track and reported every gain or mishap of the racing autos. And at such extensive pageants as that of the Quebec Tercentenary in 1908, where 4,000 actors came and went upon a 10-acre stage, every order was given by a telephone. Public officials, even in the United States, have been slow to change from the old-fashioned and more dignified use of written documents and uniformed messengers. But in the last 10 years there has been a sweeping revolution in this respect, government by telephone. This is the new idea that has already arrived in the more efficient departments of the federal service. And as for the present Congress, that body has gone so far as to plan for a special system of its own in both houses, so that all official announcements may be heard by wire. Garfield was the first among American presidents to possess a telephone. An exhibition instrument was placed in his house without cost in 1878, while he was still a member of Congress. Neither Cleveland nor Harrison, for temperamental reasons, used the magic wire very often. In their time there was one lonely idle telephone in the White House, used by the servants several times a week. But with McKinley came a new order of things. To him a telephone was more than a necessity, it was a pastime, an exhilarating sport. He was the one president who really revelled in the comforts of telephony. In 1895 he had sat in his Canton home and heard the cheers of the Chicago Convention. Later he sat there and ran the first presidential telephone campaign, talked to his managers in 38 states. Thus he came to regard the telephone with a higher degree of appreciation than any of his predecessors, and eulogized it on many public occasions. "It is bringing us all closer together," was his favorite phrase. To Roosevelt the telephone was mainly for emergencies. He used it to the full during the Chicago Convention of 1907 and the Peace Conference at Portsmouth. But with Taft the telephone became again the common avenue of conversation. He introduced at least one new telephonic custom, a long-distance talk with his family every evening when he is away from home. Instead of the solitary telephone of Cleveland Harrison days, the White House has now a branch exchange of its own, Main 6, with a sheaf of wires that branch out into every room as well as to the nearest central. Next to public officials, bankers were perhaps the last to accept the facilities of the telephone. They were slow to abandon the old fallacy that no business can be done without a written record. James Stillman, of New York, was first among bankers to foresee the telephone era. As early as 1875, while Bell was teaching his infant telephone to talk, Stillman risked $2,000 in a scheme to establish a crude dial system of wire communication, which later grew into New York's first telephone exchange. At the present time, the banker who works closest to his telephone is probably George W. Perkins, of the J.P. Morgan group of bankers. He is the only man, says Morgan, who can raise 20 millions in 20 minutes. The Perkins plan of rapid transit telephony is to prepare a list of names from 10 to 30 and to flash from one to another as fast as the operator can ring them up. Recently one of the other members of the Morgan Bank proposed to enlarge its telephone equipment. "What will we gain by more wires?" asked the operator. "If we were to put in a 600 pair cable, Mr. Perkins would keep it busy." The most brilliant feat of the telephony in the financial world was done during the panic of 1907. At the height of the storm, on a Saturday evening, the New York bankers met in almost desperate conference. They decided, as an emergency measure of self-protection, not to ship to Western banks. At midnight they telephoned this decision to the bankers of Chicago and St. Louis. These men, in turn, conferred by telephone, and on Sunday afternoon called up the bankers of neighbouring states. And so the news went from phone to phone until by Monday morning all bankers and chief depositors were aware of the situation and prepared for the team play that prevented any general disaster. As for stockbrokers of the Wall Street species, they transact practically all of their business by telephone. In their stock exchange stand 641 booths, each one the terminus of a private wire. A firm of brokers will count it an ordinary year's talking to send 50,000 messages, and there is one firm which last year sent twice as many. Of all brokers, the one who finally accomplished most by telephony was unquestionably E. H. Harriman. In the mansion that he built at Arden there were 100 telephones, with 60 of them linked to the long-distance lines. What the brush is to the artist, what the chisel is to the sculptor, the telephone was to Harriman. He built his fortune with it. It was in his library, his bathroom, his private car, his camp in the Oregon wilderness. No transaction was too large or too involved to be settled over its wires. He saved the credit of the Erie by telephone, lent it $5 million as he lay at home on a sickbed. "He is a slave to the telephone," wrote a magazine editor. "Nonsense," replied Harriman, "it is a slave to me." The telephone arrived in time to prevent big corporations from being unwieldy and aristocratic. The foreman of a Pittsburgh coal company may now stand in his subterranean office and talk to the president of the Steel Trust, who sits on the 21st floor of a New York skyscraper. The long-distance talks especially have grown to be indispensable to the corporations whose plants are scattered and geographically misplaced. To the mills of New England, for instance, that use the cotton of the South and sell so much of their product to the Middle West. To the companies that sell perishable commodities. An instantaneous conversation with a buyer in a distant city has often saved a carload or a cargo. Such gatherers as the meat packers, who were among the first to realize what Bell had made possible, have greatly accelerated the wheels of their business by intercity conversations. For 10 years or longer the Cudahy's have talked every business morning between Omaha and Boston, via 1,570 miles of wire. In the refining of oil, the Standard Oil Company alone, at its New York office, sends 230,000 messages a year. In the making of steel, a chemical analysis is made of each cauldron of molten pig iron when it starts on its way to be refined, and this analysis is sent by telephone to the steelmaker so that he will know exactly how each potful is to be handled. In the floating of logs downriver, instead of having relays of shouters to prevent the logs from jamming, there is now a wire along the bank with a telephone linked on at every point of danger. In the rearing of skyscrapers, it is now usual to have a temporary wire strung vertically so that the architect may stand on the ground and confer with a foreman who sits astride of a naked girder 300 feet up in the air. The first steamship line to use the telephone was the Clyde, which had a wire from their dock to the office in 1877, and the first railway was the Pennsylvania, which 2 years later was persuaded by Professor Bell himself to give it a trial in Altoona. Since then this railroad has become the chief beneficiary of the art of telephony. It has 175 exchanges, 400 operators, 13,000 telephones, and 20,000 miles of wire, a more ample system than the city of New York had in 1896. In the operation of trains, the railroads have waited 30 years before they dared to trust the telephone, just as they waited 15 years before they dared to trust the telegraph. In 1883 a few railways used the telephone in a small way, but in 1907, when a law was passed that made telegraphers highly expensive, there was a general swing to the telephone. Several dozen roads have now put it in use, some employing it as an associate of the Morse method and others as a complete substitute. It has always been found to be the quickest way of dispatching trains. It will do in 5 minutes what the telegraph did in 10, and it has enabled railroads to hire more suitable men for the smaller offices. In news gathering too, much more than in railroading, the day of the telephone has arrived. The Boston Globe was the first paper to receive news by telephone. Later came the Washington Star, which had a wire strung to the Capitol and thereby gained an hour over its competitors. Today the evening papers receive most of their news over the wire. This has resulted in a specialization of reporters. One man runs for the news and another man writes it. Some of the runners never come to the office. They receive their assignments by telephone and their salary by mail. There are even a few who are allowed to telephone their news directly to a swift linotype operator who clicks it into type on his machine without the scratch of pencil. This, of course, is the ideal method of news gathering, which is rarely possible. A paper of the first class, such as the New York World, had now an outfit of 20 trunk lines and 80 telephones. Its outgoing calls are 200,000 a year, and its incoming calls 300,000, which means that for every morning, evening and Sunday edition there has been an average of 750 messages. The ordinary newspaper in a small town cannot afford such a service, but recently the United Press has originated a cooperative method. It telephones the news over one wire to 10 or 12 papers at the same time. In 10 minutes 1,000 words can in this way be flung out to a dozen towns as quickly as by telegraph and much more cheaply. But it is in a dangerous crisis, when safety seems to hang upon a second, that the telephone is at its best. It is the instrument of emergencies, a sort of ubiquitous watchman. When a girl operator in the exchange hears a cry for help, "Quick, the hospital, the fire department, the police!" she seldom waits to hear the number. She knows it, she is trained to save half seconds. And it is at such moments, if ever, that the users of a telephone can appreciate its insurance value. No doubt if a King Richard III were worsted on a modern battlefield, his instinctive cry would be, "My kingdom for a telephone!" When instant action is needed in the city of New York, a general alarm can in 5 minutes be sent by the police wire over its whole vast area of 300 square miles. When, recently, a gas main broke in Brooklyn, 60 girls were at once called to the centrals in that part of the city to warn the 10,000 families who had been placed in danger. When the ill-fated General Slocum caught fire, a mechanic in a factory on the waterfront saw the blaze and had the presence of mind to telephone the newspapers, the hospitals and the police. When a small child is lost, or a convict has escaped from prison, or the forest is on fire, or some menace from the weather is at hand, the telephone gives the news. In one tragic case, the operator in Folsom, New Mexico, refused to quit her post until she had warned her people of a flood that had broken loose in the hills above the village. Because of her courage, nearly all were saved, though she herself was drowned at the switchboard. If the disaster cannot be prevented, it is the telephone, usually, that brings first aid to the injured. After the destruction of San Francisco, Governor Guild of Massachusetts sent an appeal for the stricken city to the 354 mayors of his state, and by the courtesy of the Bell Company, which carried the messages free, they were delivered to the last and furthermost mayors in less than 5 hours. After the destruction of Messina, an order for enough lumber to build 10,000 houses was cabled to New York and telephoned to Western lumbermen. So quickly was this order filled that on the 12th day after the arrival of the cablegram, the ships were on their way to Messina with the lumber. After the Kansas City flood of 1903, when the drenched city was without railways or streetcars or electric cars, it was the telephone that held the city together and brought help to the dangerous spots. And after the Baltimore fire, the telephone exchange was the last to quit and the first to recover. Its girls sat on their stools at the switchboard until the window panes were broken by the heat. Then they pulled the covers over the board and walked out. 2 hours later the building was in ashes. 3 hours later another building was rented on the unburdened rim of the city, and the wire chiefs were at work. In 1 day there was a system of wires for the use of the city officials. In 2 days these were linked to the long-distance wires, and in 11 days a 2,000-line switchboard was in full working trim. This feat still stands as the record in rebuilding. In the supreme emergency of war, the telephone is as indispensable, very nearly, as the cannon. This, at least, is the belief of the Japanese, who handled their armies by telephone when they drove back the Russians. Each body of Japanese troops moved forward like a silkworm, leaving behind it a glistening strand of red copper wire. At the decisive battle of Mukden, the silkworm army, with 1,000,000 legs, crept against the Russian hosts in a vast crescent, 100 miles from end to end. By means of this glistening red wire, the various batteries and regiments were organized into 15 divisions. Each group of 3 divisions was wired to a general, and the 5 generals were wired to the great Oyama himself, who sat 10 miles back of the firing line and sent his orders. Whenever a regiment lunged forward, one of the soldiers carried a telephone set. If they held their position, 2 other soldiers ran up with a spool of wire. In this way, and under fire of the Russian cannon, 150 miles of wire were strung across the battlefield. As the Japanese said, it was this quote-unquote flying telephone that enabled Oyama to manipulate his forces as handily as though he were playing a game of chess. It was in this war, too, that the Mikado's soldiers strung the costliest of all telephone wires at 203-meter hill. When the wire had been basted up this hill to the summit, the fortress of Port Arthur lay at their mercy. But the climb had cost them 24,000 lives. Of the 7 million telephones in the United States, about 2 million are in farmhouses. Every 4th American farmer is in telephonic touch with his neighbors and the market. Iowa leads among the farming states. Not to have a telephone in Iowa is to belong to what a Londoner would call the quote-unquote submerged tenth of the population. Second in line comes Illinois, with Kansas, Nebraska and Indiana following closely behind. And at the foot of the list in the matter of farm telephones are Connecticut and Louisiana. The first farmer who discovered the value of the telephone was the market gardener. Next came the bonanza farmer of the Red River Valley. Such a man, for instance, as Olive Dalrymple of North Dakota, who found that by the aid of the telephone he could plant and harvest 30,000 acres of wheat in a single season. Then, not more than half a dozen years ago, there arose a veritable telephone crusade among the farmers of the Middle West. Cheap telephones that were fairly good had by this time been made possible by the improvements of the Bell engineers, and stories of what could be done by telephone became the favorite gossip of the day. One farmer had kept his barn from being burned down by telephoning for his neighbors. Another had cleared $600 of extra profit on the sale of his cattle by telephoning to the best market. A third had rescued a flock of sheep by sending quick news of an approaching blizzard. A fourth had saved his son's life by getting an instantaneous message to the doctor, and so on. How the telephone saved a $3 million fruit crop in Colorado in 1909 is the story that is oftenest told in the West. Until that year, the frosts in the spring nipped the buds. No farmer could be sure of the harvest. But in 1909, the fruit growers bought smudge pots, 300,000 or more. These were placed in the orchards, ready to be lit at a moment's notice. Next, an alliance was made with the United States Weather Bureau, so that whenever the Frost King came down from the north, a warning could be telephoned to the farmers. Just when Colorado was pink with apple blossoms, the first warning came: "Get ready to light up your smudge pots in half an hour." Then the farmers telephoned to the nearest towns: "Frost is coming, come and help us in the orchards." Hundreds of men rushed out into the country on horseback and in wagons. In half an hour the last warning came: "Light up, the thermometer registers 29." The smudge-pot artillery was set ablaze and kept blazing until the news came that the icy forces had retreated. And in this way every Colorado farmer who had a telephone saved his fruit. End of section 105.
Section 106 of The United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in October 2020. The World's Story, Volume 13, The United States. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 106. How the Panama Railroad was built. 1849 to 1855, by Hugh C. Weir. The Panama Railroad was commenced in 1849, and in 1855 the first train passed over its rails. Its probable cost was estimated at $5 million, but the necessity of bringing all things needed from the United States and the increase in the price of labor resulting from the discovery of gold in California brought the amount up to $7.5 million. The following article gives some idea of the difficulties and dangers which had to be met. The Editor. The section boss thrust his head beyond his tent flap and instantly drew back with a hoarse gasp of terror. Half-dressed and half-stunned, he took a cautious step outside the door, and then another, until he came into full view of the half-moon of twisted, bloated horrors swung on the palm trees before him. 125 coolies from the Chinese camp were suspended by their queues from the swaying branches. Driven mad by the gloom of the jungle, they had sought wholesale suicide in the night. For years the section boss had rubbed elbows with death. He had come to look upon grim things with a grin. But as he digested the scene before him, his knees gave way, and he toppled forward in a sprawling faint. The incident was but one link in the chain of the horrors of the Panama Railroad. Those were red years for the construction gang of the first line of rails to span the American continent. On a roadbed of blood the ties were laid which were to mark an industrial epoch. If it was the narrowest point of the continent, it was also the wildest. 47 miles linked the Atlantic and the Pacific at this land ribbon of the Caribbean, but they were 47 miles of tragedies. With the exception of a wandering adventurer, the engineers were the first white men to force a way through the jungle since the daredevil days of the Spanish Main. And it was the devil's own cauldron, in very truth, into which they plunged. There are those who say the road cost the life for every tie. Exaggerated? Possibly, but grim facts show that more than 6,000 men went to their deaths in the tangled underbrush before the last rail was laid. Every mile of progress cost over 127 lives. The history of these 47 miles of track is one of the most tingling, red-blooded chapters in all the records of American railroad building. It is more. It is a monument to the undaunted, unrivaled heroism of American engineers, which no section of the globe can surpass. It is something over half a century ago, to be exact in the autumn of 1849, that the first construction gang, bunking at night on board a cramped sailing vessel in the Colon harbor, plunged into the red mud of the Panama swamps. Waist-deep in the slimy depths, forced to chop every foot of the way through the heavy, interlacing foliage, the men entered resolutely into the task which was to stretch over a period of more than 6 years. In the first year, over 100 died from snake bites alone. The victims of the tarantula and the scorpion numbered as many more. Buzzing swarms of mosquitoes from the pestilent pools and streams inland settled like a heavy grey cloud over their shoulders, bringing typhoid, malaria, yellow fever. Men died by scores and hundreds, and their comrades, with the sickly yellow of disease stamping their brows, gave them a hasty grave and a hastier prayer, and plunged again into the conquest of the wilderness. Nature conspired to make the picture yet blacker. Sudden stretches of quicksands were found, whose boundaries were marked by the despairing shrieks of stumbling victims. The swamp grew thicker and blacker and marshier. Engineering statistics report that often bottom was not found at a distance of 180 feet. Thousands of cords of wood and stone were dumped into the mysterious morasses in a desperate effort to construct causeways for the roadbed. Even to this day, in the gloomy shadows of the Black Swamp, a scant 5 miles from the Atlantic terminal of Colon, the slimy earth sinks into a yawning cavern, and rails, ties, and men drop forever from sight. Once a freight car was dumped into the hungry morass in an effort to make a solid surface. Within 6 hours the car had disappeared from view, and the black slime seemed to clamor for more. It was at Bas Obispo that the wholesale suicide pact of the coolies climaxed the terrors of the road builders. In the early 50s, a consignment of 1,000 Chinese had been imported to recruit the shattered ranks of laborers. For 6 depressing weeks the coolies struggled under the lash of the jungle. When the swaying burden of the palm trees, in the soft light of the early morning, showed the ghastly fate their companions had sought, it was as a spark of gunpowder. The Americans endeavored in vain to check the mill race of the panic. Before the day was over, 300 more had been added to the suicide roll. Scores rushed to the shores of the Atlantic, and squatting stoically in the sands, waited for the white crest of the tide to sweep them away. It was from Reynolds, civil engineer, and Brewster, mining prospector, that I heard the story as we sipped English cola on the veranda of the Cristobal YMCA building just above the blue Atlantic. Reynolds nodded to the group of railroad men who lounged out of the reading room as he rose to the feet. "Yes, it is a black-bordered story," he said slowly. "The history of the Panama Railroad isn't made up of ice-cream adjectives." "But the men who gave their lives for it didn't die in vain," added Brewster gravely, and we all stared out at the grey line of the surf in silence. Afterwards I verified the date I had in mind. It was on the 27th day of January 1855 that the first locomotive crossed the American continent from ocean to ocean, by way of the Panama Railroad. Coupled with the heroism of the builders, the greed of the promoters has been the outstanding quality in the history of the Panama Railroad. In the course of 50 years it is estimated that the line, less than 50 miles in length, has made a net profit of more than $75 million. In proportion to its size, it has probably produced the greatest earnings of any railroad in the history of the world. It was in 1848, at the beginning of the California gold craze, that William Henry Aspinwall, John Lloyd Stevens, and Henry Chauncey of New York incorporated the Panama Railroad Company. From the outset, the most amazing hold-up schemes in railroad history were instituted. The original cost of the line amounted roughly to $8 million. Often the profits totaled $2 million annually. For years a passenger rate of 16 cents a mile was demanded. Realizing how thoroughly the line dominated the transcontinental shipping situation, the company announced the most colossal freight rate ever known. A toll was established, amounting to 50% of the transportation charge for the entire distance between New York and Valparaiso, 4,630 miles. In other words, the shipping expense for the 47 miles of the land route was as great as the charge for the 4,583 miles of the water route. Enormous quantities of coffee from the Central and South American plantations were shipped to European markets via the Panama Railroad. The total transportation charge was $30 a ton. Of this amount, the railroad company coolly demanded one half, $15 for 47 miles. The shipper was helpless. The railroad could carry his goods from ocean to ocean in 5 hours. On the other hand, if he followed the water route and sent his products down around Cape Horn, often 5 months were required to make the same distance. In the fall of 1879, when the Lesseps undertook the construction of the Panama Canal for the French, the railroad was offered to him for $14 million, a rate of $200 a share. The Lesseps haughtily informed the company that it was a hold-up price. "Very well," was the calm rejoinder. "The price will advance $25 a share every 6 months." The Lesseps shrugged his shoulders and went to work. The railroad officials grinned and also went to work. The shipments of the French supplies began to be delayed. Machinery which reached Colon in September did not arrive at Culebra 15 miles away until October. Cars, filled with French goods, were mysteriously sidetracked and allowed to stand for days in the jungle. Gradually, the Lesseps realized that the railroad had the upper hand. "How much for the stock now?" he asked in desperation. "It is 12 months since our first offer," was the reply. "You will have to pay $250. And the Lesseps paid it. Instead of $14 million, the road cost the French $17.5 million. For 12 years, the Panama Railroad remained under French ownership. It was in 1902, when France shook herself free forever from the shadow of de Lesseps' historic failure in the Panama jungles, that the American government secured the railroad, together with the entire canal property and equipment, for $40 million, less than half of the value placed upon it by a conservative receiver. Although both the Panama Railroad and Panama Canal are government institutions, a broad line separates the two. The former handles the dirt trains of the canal entirely in the relation of a lessee. Nearly 3 million cubic yards of dirt are excavated by the canal diggers every 30 days. Were it not for the Panama Railroad, the question of its disposal would make the task of the Isthmian Canal Commission an impossibility. End of section 106. Section 107 of The United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in October 2020. The World's Story, Volume 13, The United States, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 107, The Steam Shovel at Panama, by Hugh C. Weir. The idea of cutting the Isthmus of Panama by a canal is an old one, discussed as early as 1528. As time passed, it was brought forward by numerous persons, and many surveys were made. In 1878, a French company attempted to cut through the isthmus, spent a large amount of money, and failed. A second attempt was also given up for lack of money. At length, the United States determined to undertake the work. Colombia refused to assent to a proposed treaty for the construction of the canal, and thereupon the province of Panama promptly seceded, and the United States, with equal promptness, recognized the new republic. A treaty was made at once, granting the right to make the canal. The French company was paid $40 million for its property, and the canal was dug. The sanitary conditions of the isthmus had been one of the worst obstacles which the French had had to encounter, but the United States paved the streets, drained the swamps, installed waterworks, and built sewers, and was so successful in its attempts to shut out yellow fever, malaria, and kindred diseases that Panama may almost be looked upon as a health resort. The Editor. "All in?" called Peterson curtly over his shoulder. Bending forward, he switched the starting gear into place. The car darted swiftly down the rails, and we were off. We swung past the Culebra station, every moment adding to our speed. The morning air was whipping our faces with a pleasant, invigorating thrill, and the spirit of the swift dash was beginning to take firm hold of us. Peterson slackened his pace as we neared the switch beyond, and hurriedly crossed his hands out over the side of the car, the silent signal to the workmen ahead that he wished to change into the adjoining line. On his side, Jim was duplicating the caution, which was soon to grow familiar to us. It was at White House, a small dot of a station between Culebra and the neighboring point of Empire, that we again swerved our course, and Peterson cried, "We are entering the big cut now. Keep your eyes open, Jim." The need of the warning was soon apparent. Within the space of the next 8 miles, over 100 locomotives were backing and switching, often barely grazing each other as they darted to and fro in the swirling mist of their own steam. A collision might come at any moment, even with the experienced hand of Peterson guiding us. Attached to scores of the engines were long rows of dirt cars, partially filled, every moment adding to their great loads of clay and rocks. "There are more men killed on the Panama Railroad dodging dirt trains than from any other cause," Peterson grimly informed us. Which was pleasant intelligence, as we darted down past the bumping rows of swaying cars, and they darted down past us, the motor and the trains really playing an exciting game of hide-and-seek or prisoner's base. The towering walls of Culebra Cut were now rising above us, their great rugged faces seeming to scowl in baffled rage at the army of sweating men below, who day by day were ploughing deeper and farther into their sides. For centuries these great, swollen mountains had defied the assaults of men, laughing at their efforts to bore a passage through their rocky ridges. And now the men, in their turn, were laughing at the efforts of the bullying mountains to check their advance. Have you ever studied the picture of a noted battlefield? Do you recall the thick clouds of smoke, the spurting cannon, the stacks of rifles, the heaps of dead and wounded men? Change the field of battle to Culebra Cut. You will see the same thick, black clouds of smoke. Instead of the belching cannon, you will find 100 times more deadly instrument in the giant dynamite blasts. The monster steam shovels, the great levelers and air drillers are the weapons of warfare, and the opposing forces are the armies of men and nature. It is not one battle, but a series of deadly battles, and they are all to the death. Hundreds of men, thousands of men are before and behind and around us, black men, white men, yellow men, red men, men with their coats and shirts and collars off, with grimy hands and perspiring faces and straining shoulders, men to whom a dozen different languages might be addressed without finding their native tongues. Over all tower the great scalding cliffs. Before you is the constant swirl of brown smoke, and on every side the screech of shrill locomotive whistles, the hoarse shouts of toiling men, the grinding crunch of the steam shovels. Peterson turned suddenly as we worked our way in between the overhanging cliff walls. Our speed was but little more than a bare, zigzagging crawl, and cried crisply, "We're coming to one of the largest steam shovels on the isthmus. Do you want to stop?" In answer to my nod, the motor paused, and I sprang out onto the ground, at close quarters with my first steam shovel. If you can imagine pounds magnified to tons, and can conceive of a monster iron scoop that can handle these tons as easily as you can handle an ordinary baseball, if you can picture such a gigantic machine so cleverly constructed that it is possible for one man to swing the Great Dipper where and when he pleases, you will have a dim framework of the American steam shovel as it is operating at the Big Ditch. Can you go a step farther and imagine the man placed in such a position that he is hidden from view, the monster scoop seeming to work of its own accord, a great, rough creature of iron and steel suddenly giving the power of life? If you can, you will have an even better idea of what the steam shovel really is. I clambered across onto the half-filled dirt train beside the motor that I might get a closer view. As I did so, the iron dipper struck a mammoth boulder half buried in the red clay below. Deeper and deeper, its 4 iron teeth worked their way into the sticky mud at the base of the great stone. The boulder suddenly leaned over under the weight of the scoop, and then, as I gasped, it was lifted bodily from the ground, wedged tightly between the gaping iron jaws. The shovel gave a terrific upward jerk, and almost before I realized it, the huge stone was being suspended in the air above my head. "Jump!" shouted Peterson from the motor. "Great Scott, man, that boulder weighs 20 tons!" I didn't wait for additional explanation. With the most rapid step I think I have ever made, I sprang to the ground, and none too soon. The next moment the flap of the dipper opened, and the boulder dropped into the flat car with a dull thud. But it didn't stay. Hardly had it settled on the clay when it turned on its side, rolling ponderously toward the ground. The steam shovel wasn't idle, however. With a slow, awkward movement it again swung around, its iron edge striking the rock with a force that caromed it sharply over in the other direction. And then, as though the boulder was suddenly fired with electric energy, it plunged off toward the opposite end of the car, every instant gathering new force. Again the steam shovel worked around, and this time, with a resounding jar, dealt the giant slab of granite another blow. The boulder's course was abruptly checked, but only momentarily. A third time it commenced to roll, plugging toward the ground with even greater velocity than before. It was a thrilling crisis for the layman. With a jerk as though it had gathered all of its energies for a final spurt, the great shovel pivoted about, hesitated as if measuring the most effective spot at which to strike, and literally grappled with its granite opponent. The boulder's massive strength drew a ringing crash from the iron dipper, but it had brought up against an obstacle it could not move. It was vanquished. Slowly the steam shovel withdrew, hovering in the neighborhood a moment, ready for another attack. But the stone was firmly lodged this time. The dipper had done its work well. "How many miles of track would you guess have been laid on the isthmus?" queried Peterson as our car threaded its way beyond a more than usually active row of dirt trains. "Possibly 100, I suggested. He laughed as he shook his head. "You will have to multiply that number by 4, and then add some," he rejoined. "There are 448 miles of rails in Panama, in a distance of just 47 miles. In other words, we often have 12 and 15 tracks in a row. There are fully this many before us now." During a lull in the activity around me, I glanced at the cliff above. Its scarred, jagged surface showed nearly every color of the rainbow. Here was a surface of gray, there a bright scarlet hue, yonder a line of tan, to the left a dark slate color, below a flaming yellow, the blending outlines of the different strata of dirt uncovered in the ever-deepening excavations. "There is the famous Gold Hill to our left," explained Peterson. "Gold Hill?" I repeated. "The point from which Balboa discovered the Pacific," the chauffeur added. "The ocean is 12 miles from here," he continued. "You can see it easily on a clear day, but I wouldn't care to have had Balboa's trip to reach it, eh?" I wondered curiously what the explorer's feelings would have been could he have pictured the present scene in Culebra Cut. Assuredly he would have termed the steam shovel a fabled giant lurking in the Panama wilderness like the dragons of old. It was easy to see now that we were approaching the end of the great cut. The cliffs had broken off sharply, and the number of workmen had abruptly lessened. Peterson brought the car to a sudden halt, the turntable was again brought into play, and we were switched off at right angles to begin our circling way back to Culebra through the dark undergrowth of the jungle. End of section 107. Section 108 of The United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in October 2020. The World's Story, Volume 13, The United States. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 108. The Triumph of the Wireless, 1909. By Captain J.B. Ranson, Royal Naval Reserve. On the morning of the disaster, we had already made the Nantucket lightship by the submarine Belle. The Baltic was inward bound for New York from Liverpool, and we were going at a reduced speed in a very heavy fog. We had located the lightship about midnight, and had proceeded about 80 miles to the westward. At 7:15 on that Saturday morning, the wireless operator came rushing up to me on the bridge. He did not take time to write the message on the usual printed form, but had put it down on the first slip of paper he could lay his hands on, and handed me this message. The Republic dangerously. Latitude 40.17 north, longitude 70 west. You can see from the wording of the message, from which some such word as injured is apparently omitted after the word dangerously, in what urgent haste it was sent. It came from the wireless station at Siasconset on the island of Nantucket. My first move was to throw the helm hard a-starboard and make for the position of the Republic with all possible speed. We knew her latitude and longitude, and our job was to find her in the thickest kind of a fog. At that time we were 64 miles from the position given us in the first message from the Republic, but of course she was drifting all the time, and during our 12-hour search I estimate we traveled 200 miles in our zigzag course before we found her, and all within a sea area of 10 square miles. But before I go on with the story, I might explain the 3 scientific methods which we employed in our hunt for the drifting Republic. These were wireless telegraphy, the submarine bell and telephone system, and Sir William Thomson's apparatus for sounding. Wireless telegraphy you are doubtless familiar with. Almost all passenger vessels, as well as naval ships, are supplied with it and can communicate with each other or with the stations on land within a radius of 200 miles. A wireless message cannot convey to you the definite position of a moving vessel. The electric waves from a wireless instrument move in a circle. It is like throwing a stone into the water, and the stronger you throw the stone, the farther the wavelets go. So, if you get a distress call, the vessel sending it may be anywhere in any direction within a circle of 200 miles, of which the sending vessel is the center. Of course, a vessel in trouble can send her latitude and longitude, and that helps to locate her. But if you are in a fog and have lost your reckoning, wireless will not help you much in regard to the position of the land. But a submarine bell will. The Nantucket lightship, like all modern lightships in this country, Great Britain and the continent of Europe, has a submarine bell which is kept constantly ringing, by compressed air, I believe. The sound waves go out below the surface of the water and can be heard for a distance of 17 miles by passing ships with the proper instruments installed. On my ship, for example, there are 2 apertures on either side of the bow, which you might call submarine ears. They are connected by wires with a telephone receiver on the bridge. By listening at this telephone and switching the instrument from the starboard ear to the port ear and back again, you can hear the faint tones of the lightship's submarine bell when you get in range of it. If the tone is louder through the starboard ear than through the port ear, you know the lightship is on your starboard side. If the tone is exactly the same through both ears, you know the lightship is dead ahead. This apparatus helped me greatly, as I shall explain later, in finding the Republic. The third method I employed, in connection with the wireless telegraph and submarine bell, was Sir William Thomson's sounding apparatus. The Baltic was equipped with this appliance, and we could take soundings to the depth of 100 fathoms while going at full speed. Employing the ordinary method of a sounding lead attached to a rope, you have to stop your ship dead to take a sounding. The modern sounding appliance is attached to a wire like a piano string, and it goes to the bottom, records the depth, and is hoisted to the deck again without the ship's speed being retarded a second. Moreover, the weight at the end of the wire is filled with a substance, often just common brown soap, to which some of the soil or sand or mud of the bottom of the sea sticks. An examination of this material, which is frequently described on the charts or is known from previous experience, helps to locate your position. This explanation will enable you to understand a little better, perhaps, how we pursued the Republic all day long, like a hound on the scent, and finally found her at about 6:30 in the evening, after steering and zigzagging about all day. The Republic's position, as I have already said, kept constantly changing in the fog, and as fast as I could get to a point of latitude and longitude noted in the last wireless message received, Captain Sealby on the Republic would have moved, involuntarily of course, to another. I was getting wireless messages thick and fast all the time, from Captain Sealby on the Republic, from the company's office in New York via Siasconset, and from the other ships which had joined in the search for the Republic in response to the CQD distress call, of which we have heard so much during the past few days. This is a general danger signal to all ships equipped with wireless apparatus within range, and warns them to be on the alert to render help if necessary. The initials CQD may naturally be supposed to stand for Come Quick, Danger. The message I received was as follows. Here general call and message repeated. Republic 15 miles south of Nantucket light vessel. Requires immediate assistance. Do utmost to reach her. Siasconset. Among the ships responding to the CQD message were the Louisiana, La Lorraine, the Fournesia, the New York, the Gresham, and the Seneca, the latter two being United States government vessels. You can easily imagine that our operator was kept pretty busy receiving these messages and sending them to the bridge, and that on the bridge we were kept busy, not merely responding to them by wireless replies, but changing the course of our ship in response to the directions or instructions which they gave. As a matter of fact, it may literally be said that my ship, the Baltic, was steered some of the time by Captain Sealby on the Republic. For example, read these messages from Captain Sealby. Here Captain Ransom selected from a pile of 100 or more telegrams, written on the thin paper blanks of the Marconi Company, the following dispatches, apologizing for their somewhat bedraggled appearance, which he explained was due to the fog and rain that enveloped the Baltic's bridge, where they had been received and read. The Outlook editors. You are getting louder. Keep steering east-southeast. Listen for our ship's bell. Sealby. Steer southeast now. Sealby. But it was not only these direct instructions that helped me, which were received, of course, after we were near enough to the Republic so that she could hear our whistle and the bombs we were firing. Some of Captain Sealby's telegrams helped me by inference. For example, quite early in the day I received this wireless. Have picked up Nantucket by submarine bell bearing north-northeast, sounding 35 fathoms. Sealby. Now, this gave me very important and useful information. I knew that the Nantucket lightship's bell could be heard by the submarine telephone not over 17 miles, and that therefore the Republic must be within a radius of 17 miles from the lightship. Consequently, when I could not hear the submarine myself, I knew that I was outside of the Republic's position. In the second place, I knew the Republic was in 35 fathoms of water. So we kept sounding continually, and as soon as we struck 40 fathoms, we changed our course to strike 35 fathoms, for I knew there was no use of our being in 40 fathoms when they were in 35, and so it was when we got near enough to the Republic for them to hear our whistle. When I received a message from Captain Sealby saying, "We heard your whistle, but it has gone out of range now," we immediately changed our course to get within range again. Here are some of the messages received during the day that indicate the kind of wireless conversation that was continually going on. Luciana says, please listen for his 4 blasts. Republic says we can hear a bomb to the west of us. Is it you? La Lorraine says he hears Republic's bell and is steering straight towards him. La Lorraine says, tell Captain Ransom we are blowing a whistle, not a horn. Please make as much noise as possible. Have not heard Luciana, but she is still around. Am in touch with Lorraine. Sealby. La Lorraine and Baltic ask Republic if he hears bell, bomb, or whistle. He replies he hears steamer's whistle and thinks we both must be close to him. Baltic operator. Republic operator says, we are sinking rapidly. We are keeping everything clear and standing by for Republic's signals. Baltic operator. Captain Baltic, am cruising round trying to locate you. Captain Luciana. Captain Baltic, there is a bomb bearing northwest from me. Keep firing. Sealby. Siasconset says here from Republic, says to Baltic to hurry, they are sinking fast. Baltic operator. Tell Captain Ransom steer northeast at once. Sealby. For Nesia, which had turned round to render assistance, now 35 miles west Nantucket, will take 3 hours to get back. Siasconset. Captain Ransom, can we be of any assistance? If not, we'll proceed to New York, as we have hardly enough coal to reach port. You are very close now. Right abeam. Come carefully. You are on your port side. Have just seen your rocket. You are very close to us. Sealby. These messages, taken at random from scores of others, may seem somewhat matter-of-fact to you, but I can assure you they meant a good deal to us on the bridge of the Baltic, and they indicate how we had to feel our way. After 12 hours' search, zigzagging and circling in the fog, changing our course as each new bit of information came by wireless, we at last found the Republic. We came within 100 feet of the ship before we could see anything, and then we saw only the faint glare of a green light they were burning, like the illumination you burn on the 4th of July. The ship's side lights we could not distinguish, and that was why there was no real use in sending up rockets, although we did so constantly on the chance of their being seen. The passengers had already been taken aboard the Florida, so there was no anxiety about them. The Florida was still well afloat, and there was no danger of her going down, so the first thing for us to do was to transfer the crew from the Republic to our ship. Later we steamed to the Florida and took off the passengers of both ships. As far as I could ascertain, the number taken from the Florida was 1,516 people. There was quite a nasty sea running and a thick fog. We went to leeward. We did not dare to go to windward of the Florida, as we should have been blown on top of her. The process of transfer was simple enough. We started at 11 o'clock on Saturday night, and the crews of the 3 ships, the Republic, the Florida, and the Baltic, rowed back and forth in the Republic's lifeboats, and finished the next morning about 8 o'clock. Both passengers and crews behaved remarkably well, but I am sure it seemed to them a perfectly simple and natural thing to do, although of course somewhat uncomfortable. The unusual thing about it was that the Republic's passengers were transferred twice for reasons of safety, within a comparatively few hours, on the open sea and in small boats. This has never occurred before in my experience. You ask why Captain Sealby felt that he must stick by his ship even at great personal risk. It is true that he and his second officer were the only ones on board when the Republic foundered, and were thrown into the sea and rescued with some difficulty on account of the darkness. They ran this risk, not in the least to indulge in pyrotechnics, for Captain Sealby is not that kind of a man, but for two very good reasons. First, it is a tradition of the sea that a captain must stick to his ship until the last hope is gone, and that then he must be the last one to leave her. In the second place, if he should abandon his ship even with the conviction that she was hopelessly lost, and then some other vessel or seaman should come along and save her, his own judgment could very easily be questioned, and his reputation as a resourceful and trustworthy commander would be irretrievably ruined. As to the work involved, it was hard for everybody concerned, but that is a part of the trade. During the time of the search, I was where I had to be, of course, on the bridge. I went up about 6 o'clock on Friday morning and stayed there until we docked at 1 o'clock on Monday afternoon, about 80 hours. Food? My food was brought up to me. Sleep? Why, no, I was there on the bridge walking around. I couldn't have slept even had I gone below. However, that is not unusual. We often have 2 or 3 days on the bridge without rest in bad weather, and the effect of that is usually that one cannot sleep for some time afterward. For instance, on Monday night, after I got ashore and was free from all responsibility, I could not sleep. Yes, all these modern appliances which aided us in our search for the Republic add greatly to the safety of passengers. These modern devices for safety in navigation correspond to the block signal system in railroad travel. Of course, we have our lookout up in the crow's nest who calls out, "All's well," just as the lookout did before modern safeguards were thought of. We have had the submarine bell apparatus on all the White Star ships for about 5 years. It is a comparatively recent invention. American? Yes, an American invention, from Boston, I believe. I see no reason to think that we have reached the climax of invention for safety devices in navigation. There is always something new. Who would have thought 10 years ago of wireless messages to be used in saving life at sea? Nobody dreamed of it, and it is quite possible to conceive that other discoveries may be made of equal benefit to navigation. End of section 108.
Section 109 of the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. The World Story, Volume 13. The United States. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 109. The National Red Cross at Work. By Constance D. Loop. Early in the afternoon of Tuesday, March 25, 1913, the telephone bell rang in the office of the National Red Cross at the War Department in Washington. "Miss Boardman," said a man's voice. "This is the office of the Associated Press. The Miami River is rising in Ohio, and the town of Dayton is partly under water. Other rivers are rising, and it looks as if there might be serious trouble." Miss Mabel Boardman, chairman of the National Relief Board of the American National Red Cross, ascertained the meager details, rang off, dictated a telegram to Governor Cox of Ohio, asking if he needed help, and turned her attention back to the really serious situation in tornado-swept Omaha. Governor Cox telegraphed back his thanks, but said the trouble was not serious. Then followed 3 telegrams in quick succession the same afternoon, saying that matters were getting worse, the water was still rising, there were already many deaths, and that the state would be glad to have the assistance of the National Red Cross. The officers were not taken unawares. They never are, for their object in life is to lie in ambush awaiting the unexpected. And the machinery of the Red Cross is a very perfect, well-oiled piece of mechanism that can be set in motion by the pressing of one lever at headquarters. To be sure, the Director General, Mr. Ernest P. Bicknell, had started 24 hours before for Nebraska. It was problematical what he would do when he heard the CQD from Ohio, and he was out of reach of the telegraph.
To ensure a director on the scene of action in both places, the ever-vigilant Miss Boardman telegraphed Mr. Lees of Chicago to proceed to Omaha, and Mr. Edmonds of Cincinnati to take charge in Dayton pending Mr. Bicknell's arrival. So much, and a good deal more, was already accomplished before people of the country at large learned through the morning papers of Wednesday the 26th that a fearful calamity had overtaken Ohio. By that time a rescue party had been detailed, and was hurrying towards each threatened district along the rivers that were still rising with terrifying rapidity. These were no armies of well-meant, unskilled volunteers, but trained bands of emergency workers, doctors, and nurses, each under a competent general who had dropped his regular work at the Red Cross call to arms. Whatever you do every day for your living, if you are on the Red Cross emergency roll, if, in other words, you are allowed to help in time of trouble, it means that you are among the elect of your kind. On the afternoon of the 26th, the office of the Red Cross in the War Department is a particularly peaceful-looking spot. A casual glance around would never lead the uninitiated to suspect that the greatest disaster this generation has known is in progress, and that the relief work is being directed from this little room. At her desk sits Miss Boardman with her hat still on, alternately dictating telegrams and conversing on the long-distance telephone all up and down the Atlantic seacoast. A secretary is ticking a typewriter, another is being interviewed by a reporter in a corner, and an army officer is calmly reading in the afternoon paper a highly colored and brilliantly imaginative account of the news from the front. A messenger boy enters with a telegram and leans negligently against the desk with the vacuous expression that sits eternally on the face of the messenger boy. There are no floods, no wars for him, just an everlasting round of dodging in and out of elevators with dispatches. Miss Boardman tears the telegram open, glances it over hastily, calls up the Associated Press, and gives over the telephone the news that brings forth an extra within an hour in cities all over the country. A message has actually come through from the beleaguered, burning city of Dayton. A cry for help has come at last over the one intact wire that spans the flood. It is not much in the way of news, but the American people want everything there is, and the Red Cross is glad to give it to them. For where, but to the generosity of these same American people, does the Red Cross look for the money and provisions with which to carry on the work of relief? Mr. Edmonds has telegraphed from Dayton that he needs cooked food, clothing, bedding, doctors, and nurses. No tents? Asks the reporter, and is informed that the Secretary of War has dispatched those long ago from the nearest posts. From Akron, Miss Gladwin, chairman of the local Red Cross Nursing Association, has proceeded with a staff of 18 nurses to report at Columbus to Major Fauntleroy, who is the Army medical officer in charge of the division hospital being assembled there. Major Fauntleroy has a staff of 8 Army surgeons besides the equipment, which, though consisting of tents and fittings which can be packed and carried to the battlefield, is as complete as that of any hospital. 30 nurses from the nearby towns are already at Dayton, and Cincinnati is to send 10 more. Mr. James Jackson of Cleveland has taken charge at Piqua and Sydney. Dr. Edward T. Devine of New York has telephoned that he is ready to report for duty anywhere he is wanted. Ordinarily, the Red Cross makes requisitions on its nearby members. But Dr. Devine grew up near the scene of the present disaster, and besides being at home there, he is particularly valuable because of his experience in San Francisco, at the sinking of the Slocum and the Titanic, and at the Triangle Fire, so Miss Boardman asks him to go to Columbus and report to the governor. The Cincinnati and Cleveland Red Cross chapters are instructed to go ahead and raise funds and supplies. Telegrams have been dispatched to the governors of all the states, to the Red Cross state boards, and to local chapters, appealing to all for aid. In other words, the Red Cross is calling out all the reserves, which is a most unusual procedure even in very grave situations. This means an appeal for money and supplies published in every daily paper in the United States. On the morrow, the money will come rolling in, and the little band of workers in the Home Office will have plenty of bookkeeping and receipt writing, besides the work of holding themselves constantly responsive to the outside world by telephone and telegrams. Letter writing has become a lost art. The typewriters are used only to write out dispatches. At 4:30, Miss Boardman rises and pulls down the roller top of her desk. Mr. McGee, will you get out the atlas and look up all the large towns near the flooded district where we haven't chapters, and wire the mayors for aid? She waves a handful of telegrams. Oh, and this telegraphing is going to be a big expense to us. Better ask the companies for free service. There is a tradition that no soulless corporation has ever refused one of these requests from the Red Cross. Here are 2 checks that came in today from people in the city, she continues. Will you please send them to Mr. Reeside, so that the district committee may have the credit for them on their books? And here, handing a slip of paper to her secretary, is where I can be reached from 8 until 10:30, and at this house from 10:30 to 12. Before and after that, at home. And Miss Boardman draws on her gloves and pulls down her veil with the unruffled composure of one who has just completed a routine day's work. Tomorrow will bring complications of a different kind, she knows, for besides the bookkeeping and care of the money, there will be many blundering, well-meant offers of help. Out-of-the-way towns which have collected supplies and do not know how to forward them, theatrical companies who will give their services if she will make the arrangements, etc. And these things must not be allowed to clog the smooth perfection of the machinery, which is working to fill the greatest needs of the stricken communities in the shortest possible time. Now a word about the machinery itself. In 1905, the Red Cross was reorganized and put on its present basis. The President of the United States is always its president, and the executive officers make their headquarters in the capital. Miss Boardman is the chairman of the National Relief Board, and Mr. Bicknell is the national director, which means that he has charge in the field when the disaster is serious enough to require national aid. Small disasters are handled by the local organizations. The governor of each state is the president of the state board, which consists of 6 or 8 well-known business and professional men who have charge of raising funds and supplies locally. This board has nothing whatsoever to do with the relief work, which is in the charge of the institutional members. These institutional members are all of them charity organizations, and the best and most efficient of their kind. Less than 20 in the whole country qualify for membership, but these are geographically widely scattered. An officer, ordinarily the secretary, of the institutional member nearest the scene of the disaster, is the first one to proceed thither. He takes charge of the relief work, but never has the task of raising money. Besides the staff of trained workers in his own society to call upon for aid, he is also chairman of a committee consisting of a member from each of the other active charity and social organizations within the city. In addition to the state boards and the institutional members, there are the local chapters in smaller places. All this sounds much more complicated than it really is, for when a call to arms comes, each steps into his appointed place and does his prearranged task. For instance, when the office in Washington first hears of a disaster, a telegram is sent at once to the governor of the state where it occurs, to find out if the state can handle it, or if national help is wanted. At a request for national aid, the president promptly issues a proclamation and appeal, and this is followed by the appeals of the governors, if deemed necessary. The money collected locally is sent to Washington, and from there to the governor of the afflicted state. 4,000 nurses, living and practicing all over the country, are at the service of the Red Cross. A register of these nurses is kept in every large city throughout the country, so that the chairman in charge has only to send for those nearest at hand. A nurse who is on a case when a summons comes is of course excused, but must hold herself in readiness for a summons as soon as she is off duty, if the crisis is not then past. Perhaps half of the graduate nurses of the country could not qualify for the Red Cross register. Besides requiring a degree from a good school, this stern taskmaster requires 2 years of active experience, personal integrity, very sound physique, and a devotion which will make the nurses willing to come for just half the regular fees, the Red Cross in this accepting the rate of pay in vogue for the army nurses. Understudies are everywhere provided throughout this marvelous system, so that nothing is thrown out of gear even when the national director is lost. It is miraculously free from red tape. For years now it has in times of peace prepared for war, but it stands armed and vigilant against the elements rather than against a human foe. End of section 109.
Section 110 of the United States, read for LibriVox.org by Sonia. Gettysburg, 50 years after. Photograph page 558. For the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, a mighty reunion of Union and Confederate veterans was planned. Lindley M. Garrison, Secretary of War, said, "Thousands and tens of thousands of former foes are here gathered together in brotherly union. You, who first met upon this field to vie with each other in doing hurt the one to the other, now meet here to outvie each other in deeds of kindness and friendship and love. History holds no parallel." In the Battle of 1863, at the Bloody Angle, formed by a break in the stone wall, the men of Pickett and Pettigrew were jammed together and enfiladed after they had charged across the valley from Seminary Ridge, which faces Cemetery Ridge. There, though smashed to pieces by Hancock's pitiless fire, the heroic rebels broke over the stone wall, and Armistead laid his hand on a Union cannon and fell dead. They call it the high water mark of the rebellion. At the reunion, when it came to be 3 o'clock, the time when they made that other charge, Pickett's men again crowded their way through the thick underbrush and made their way up the hill. All along the stone wall eager hands bent down to help them up the wall. In every face that bent above them from the stone wall was an eager welcoming smile, and over them, as they reached it, floated a great flag, the flag of the United States, with 48 stars in it. Hancock's men pulled them over the wall, and instantly the formation was gone. The blue and the grey were huddled indiscriminately together in the Bloody Angle, clapping each other on the back and telling each other how thankful they were that they had lived to see this day. End of section 110. This recording is in the public domain. Section 111 of the United States, read for LibriVox.org by Sonia. America for Me by Henry van Dyke. 'Tis fine to see the old world and travel up and down among the famous palaces and the cities of renown, to admire the crumbly castles and the statues of the kings, but now I think I've had enough of antiquated things. So it's home again and home again, America for me. My heart is turning home again, and there I long to be, in the land of youth and freedom, beyond the ocean bars, where the air is full of sunlight and the flag is full of stars. Oh, London is a man's town, there's power in the air, and Paris is a woman's town, with flowers in her hair, and it's sweet to dream in Venice, and it's great to study Rome, but when it comes to living, there is no place like home. I like the German fir woods in green battalions drilled, I like the gardens of Versailles, with flashing fountains filled, but oh, to take your hand, my dear, and ramble for a day in the friendly western woodland where nature has her way. I know that Europe's wonderful, yet something seems to lack. The past is too much with her, and the people looking back. But the glory of the present is to make the future free. We love our land for what she is, and what she is to be. Oh, it's home again, and home again, America for me. I want a ship that's westward bound to plough the rolling sea, to the blessed land of room enough beyond the ocean bars, where the air is full of sunlight and the flag is full of stars. End of section 111. This recording is in the public domain. End of The World Story, A History of the World in Story, Song and Art, Volume 13, The United States, edited by Eva March Tappan.